There are moments in the history when peace shatters so completely that those who lived through the breaking cannot quite remember what wholeness felt like. The world had known tranquility once, or so the elders claimed in their fading recollections. They spoke of seasons when harvest came without fear, when children played without the shadow of something vast and terrible looming over their innocence. They remembered a time before the Emperor, before the monsters, before the sky itself seemed to darken with an approaching doom that no prayer could turn aside. But memory, like peace, proves fragile when confronted with the reality of flames consuming everything familiar. The world that existed before the Palamecian conquest became little more than stories told in whispers, fragments of a gentler age preserved only in the minds of those lucky or unlucky enough to survive the transformation. What came after was something else entirely, something that would demand more from ordinary people than they believed themselves capable of giving. The Empire of Palamecia had not always been a name spoken with such dread. Once, it was simply another kingdom among many, distinguished perhaps by the harshness of its desert lands and the severity of its rulers, but no more threatening than any other ambitious nation seeking to expand its borders through the usual means of diplomacy and occasional skirmish. The balance of power had held for generations, an uneasy but functional arrangement that kept any single kingdom from growing too dominant, while allowing all to prosper in their own fashion. Then came Emperor Matthias Palamecea, and with him came change of a nature that transcended mere political ambition. Some whispered that he had been corrupted by demonic forces, that the very throne of Palamecea carried a curse passed down through generations of rulers, each one succumbing to darker impulses than the last. Others claimed he had simply recognized an opportunity that previous emperors lacked the vision or courage to pursue. The truth, as is often the case with such transformative figures, likely lay somewhere in the intersection of personal ambition and cosmic malevolence, each feeding the other until distinction became meaningless. What mattered, in the end, was what Emperor Matthias accomplished. Deep within the foundations of Castle Palamecea, in chambers that predated current memory and whose original purpose had been lost to time, the Emperor discovered secrets, ancient passages sealed away by civilizations that understood the danger they represented, passages that connected the mortal world to realms that should have remained forever separate. The Jade Passage, it was called, though few who spoke the name understood its true nature. A gateway between the world of flesh and the world of darkness, between the realm of humanity and the realm of monsters, between life as it had been known and nightmare made manifest. The Emperor opened the Jade Passage, whether through ritual or raw force of will, whether through study of forbidden texts or guidance from entities that served their own inhuman purposes. He tore down barriers that had existed since the world's foundation. And through that breach came things that had no place in the daylight world. Demons and monsters, creatures of fang and claw and malice, beings that existed only to destroy and devour and spread the corruption of their dark realm into territories they had been exiled from since the dawn of creation. With this hellish army at his command, Emperor Matthias began his conquest. Not slowly, not with the careful maneuvering of traditional warfare, but with overwhelming and brutal efficiency. The Palamecian military, already formidable through conventional means, became unstoppable when reinforced by supernatural forces that felt no fear and required no supply lines. Cities fell in days that should have held for months. Kingdoms that had maintained their independence for centuries found themselves overrun before they could properly mount a defense, or call for aid from neighbors who faced their own desperate struggles for survival. The speed of the conquest was as demoralizing as the conquest itself. Refugees fleeing one fallen kingdom would arrive in the next, only to watch it too succumb to the imperial advance. The pattern repeating until nowhere seemed safe, until the very concept of safety became a memory from a world that no longer existed. Some kingdoms attempted negotiation, offering tribute and vassalage in exchange for mercy, only to discover that Emperor Matthias sought not subjects, but domination so complete that even willing submission could not satisfy it. Among the kingdoms that chose to resist rather than submit stood Fynn, a proud nation whose history stretched back through centuries of careful stewardship and noble rule. The kingdom was prosperous without being wealthy, strong without being militaristic, governed by a royal family whose authority derived more from respect than fear. When word came of the Palamecian advance, when refugees began arriving with tales of cities burning and populations put to sword or chain, the king of Fynn made his choice. His kingdom would stand, they would fight, and if they fell, they would fall with honor rather than live as slaves to a tyrant who commanded demons. The decision was brave. It was also, in the cold assessment of military reality, probably suicidal. Fynn's army was well trained and well equipped by the standards of peacetime defense, but utterly unprepared for the nature of the threat approaching their borders. How do you train soldiers to face enemies that should not exist? How do you fortify walls against creatures that might simply materialize within the city through dark magic? How do you maintain morale when every report from the front brings news of another impossibility made flesh? Still, they tried. The king rallied his forces, called upon his allies, and prepared Fynn Castle and the city surrounding it for siege. Citizens who could not fight were evacuated to smaller towns and villages, their departures marked by tears and embraces that carried the weight of permanent farewell. Those who remained did so knowing they might not survive, but determined that if Fynn was to fall, it would exact a price that even the Empire would remember. The Allies answered Fynn's call, though few could spare the forces they truly needed. The kingdom of Kashwan, bound to Fynn by ancient treaty and recent marriage alliance, sent what troops they could along with the two princes of their royal line. Scott, the elder brother, was everything a crown prince should be. Brave, skilled in combat, beloved by his people, and deeply in love with Princess Hilda of Fynn, to whom he had recently become betrothed. Gordon, younger and less certain, came because his brother came, driven more by duty than confidence, already doubting whether he possessed the courage that seemed to come so naturally to Scott. Other kingdoms sent smaller contingents or messages of support that offered everything except the material aid that might have made a difference. Some were already fighting their own desperate battles against the imperial advance. Others, more cynically, were hedging their bets, unwilling to commit resources to a cause that seemed increasingly doomed, while the possibility remained that accommodation with the Empire might purchase their own survival. The alliance that assembled to defend Fynn was brave and determined, but it was also insufficient, outnumbered and outmatched before the first blow was struck. The assault came with the dawn, though calling it an assault understates the reality of what befell Fynn. It was not a battle in any traditional sense, not a meeting of equal forces where tactics and courage might turn the tide. It was an overwhelming avalanche of violence, a demonstration of power so absolute that resistance seemed futile from the first moments. The sky darkened with unnatural storm clouds as the Imperial forces approached. monsters and human soldiers advancing in coordinated waves that spoke to careful planning despite their chaotic appearance. The defenders of Fynn fought with everything they possessed. They held the outer walls until the walls themselves collapsed under magical assault. They fell back to secondary positions and held those until overrun. They contested every street, every building, extracting what price they could from the attackers, even as the inevitable became increasingly obvious. The king himself fought in the throne room when the castle was breached, his guard dying around him as wave after wave of Black Knights, the Empire's elite soldiers clad in dark armor and wielding enchanted blades, pushed deeper into the heart of Fynn's sovereignty. Scott of Kashwan distinguished himself in the defense, his swordsmanship and tactical acumen buying precious time for civilians to escape and preventing several breakthrough attempts that might have turned the battle into a complete massacre. He fought with the desperate intensity of someone who understood they were losing, but refused to accept the implications. Each parry and counterstrike an act of defiance against the crushing weight of imperial power. When the order came to retreat, when it became clear that continuing to hold position meant nothing but pointless death, Scott was among the last to withdraw, covering the escape of Princess Hilda and those few soldiers who remained capable of following her. Gordon's experience of the battle was different and infinitely more shameful in his own estimation. When the Black Knights broke through the eastern gate and began slaughtering the defenders there, when Gordon saw friends and comrades cut down by enemies whose skill and equipment rendered resistance meaningless, something inside him broke. The courage that should have sustained him failed at the moment when it mattered most. He ran, not in tactical retreat, not as part of any organized withdrawal, but in simple panic, abandoning his position and his duty in a moment of overwhelming terror that would haunt him for everything that followed. By the time night fell on the first day of the assault, Fynn had fallen. The castle was in Imperial hands, the king captured or dead, the city itself burning as soldiers and monsters alike celebrated their victory through destruction and pillage. Princess Hilda escaped with a handful of loyal supporters, including the court mage Minwu, a white wizard whose healing magic had saved countless lives during the battle, but who could do nothing to save the kingdom itself. They fled south toward the town of Altair, a smaller settlement that might offer temporary refuge, knowing that what they carried with them, the survivors and the knowledge and the will to continue resistance, represented all that remained of a kingdom that had stood for centuries. The fall of Fynn sent shockwaves through the surrounding regions. If a kingdom as strong and well defended as Fynn could fall in a single day, what chance did anyone else have? The speed and totality of the defeat shattered whatever hope might have existed that conventional military response could slow the imperial advance. Some kingdoms immediately began sending envoys to negotiate surrender. Others simply collapsed as their defenders deserted rather than face an enemy that seemed to render all training and courage meaningless. Within weeks, the political map of the world had been redrawn, with Palamecian purple covering territories that had been independent since time immemorial. But not everyone surrendered. Not everyone lost hope. In Altair, Princess Hilda established what would become known as the Wild Rose Rebellion, named for the flower that served as Fynn's royal symbol and would now become the identification mark of resistance. They were few in number, poorly equipped, lacking the resources or military strength that conventional wisdom insisted was necessary for any real opposition to imperial power. What they possessed instead was determination born from having nothing left to lose, and a recognition that someone had to stand against tyranny even when standing seemed futile. The rebellion began modestly, more symbol than substance. A few dozen soldiers who had escaped the fall of Fynn, civilians from Altair and surrounding villages who had lost family to the Imperial advance and sought any opportunity for vengeance or justice, or simply the ability to do something rather than passively accepting their fate. They had limited weapons, no supply lines, no hope of victory in any conventional military sense. But they had Princess Hilda, whose courage and tactical mind gave form to desperate resistance. And they had Minwu, whose white magic provided healing and support that multiplied their effectiveness beyond what numbers alone would suggest. What they needed, what Princess Hilda understood they desperately required if the rebellion was to be anything more than a brief gesture before inevitable defeat, were fighters willing to risk everything. Not soldiers seeking glory or advancement, but individuals driven by such fundamental need for justice that they would walk into almost certain death if it meant striking even the smallest blow against the Empire. They needed people who had been broken by Imperial conquest and somehow found within that breaking not paralysis, but purpose. And in the forests outside the ruins of Fynn, in the aftermath of a battle that went badly for everyone involved, they would find exactly what they needed. 4 young people had called Fynn home. They were not nobles or soldiers, not figures of importance or bearers of special destiny. They were simply residents of a kingdom under siege, aged into their late teens or early 20s, bound together by the substitute family they had created after earlier tragedies had left some of them orphaned and alone. Firion had lost his birth parents years before and been taken in by the family of Leon and Maria, welcomed as a brother rather than merely a ward, integrated so completely into their household that any distinction between blood and adoption became meaningless. Maria was the heart of their small group, providing emotional stability and compassionate wisdom beyond her years. Where Firion tended toward impulsive action and Leon toward careful planning, Maria offered perspective that balanced both extremes. Guy, the 4th member of their family, was gentle and simple in his speech, having grown up among wild animals in the forests before being rescued and adopted by Leon and Maria's parents. He retained the ability to communicate with beasts, understanding their language in ways that suggested something fundamental about connection that civilization had forgotten. The 4 of them together formed something rare and precious, people who genuinely cared for each other in a world increasingly defined by self-interest and survival. When the attack on Fynn began, they had tried to help however they could. Too young to be soldiers, too untrained to join the actual fighting, they had still assisted with evacuations, carried wounded to healers, did whatever tasks needed doing by people whose hands were free. As the battle turned against the defenders and retreat became the only option for those who wished to survive, the 4 of them fled together with hundreds of other civilians, joining the stream of refugees moving away from the burning city toward any destination that might offer safety. They didn't make it far. In the forests outside Fynn, as night fell and exhausted refugees struggled through unfamiliar terrain, a patrol of Black Knights caught up with the fleeing civilians. These were not ordinary soldiers, but members of the Emperor's elite guard, individuals whose skills had been enhanced through exposure to dark magic and infusion with power drawn from the hellish realm the Emperor commanded. They wore black armor that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, wielded weapons that could cut through conventional steel as though it were parchment, and moved with speed and precision that made even trained soldiers seem clumsy by comparison. The Black Knights cut through the civilian refugees with methodical efficiency, showing no mercy to the unarmed and unprotected. Some civilians scattered into the forest, hoping to lose their pursuers in the darkness. Others froze in terror, paralyzed by the sudden violence. A few tried to fight back with whatever tools or implements they possessed. Desperate courage that accomplished nothing except briefly delaying their own deaths. The night filled with screams and the sounds of slaughter, with the smell of blood and the particular quality of silence that follows when violence ends and survivors dare to breathe again. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon tried to escape together, but the Black Knights were faster and more skilled than 4 terrified youths could possibly evade. Maria stumbled over a root in the darkness and fell, and when Leon stopped to help her, the knights closed in. The 4 of them stood together, facing enemies whose very presence radiated menace, knowing they were about to die, but determined not to die running. If these were their final moments, they would face them together, with whatever dignity could be salvaged from absolute terror. The fight lasted seconds. Firion grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the nearest knight, the improvised weapon shattering against enchanted armor without causing any apparent damage. Guy tried to rush another knight bare-handed, his size and strength meaning nothing, against a trained warrior in superior equipment. Maria screamed for them to run, to save themselves, her voice breaking with the knowledge that saving themselves was impossible. Leon positioned himself between his sister and the knights, the protective gesture both brave and futile. The Black Knight's blades rose and fell. Blood sprayed in the darkness. Bodies crumpled to the forest floor. The 4 youths, who moments before had been alive with all the complexity and potential that comes with being human, became simply corpses among countless others, casualties too minor and numerous to merit individual record in the history of conquest. The Black Knights moved on to find other refugees, leaving the bodies where they fell, the forest floor drinking their blood, and the knights swallowing their final gasps. They should have died there. By all reasonable assessment, their story should have ended in those woods. 4 more names on the infinite list of ordinary people destroyed by forces beyond their control or comprehension. No prophecy marked them as important. No destiny waited to be fulfilled. They were simply victims, and their deaths were simply tragedies of the sort that occur in thousands when kingdoms fall and empires expand. But death, it turned out, had not quite finished with them yet. Or perhaps life was not quite ready to let them go. Princess Hilda and her party, making their own escape from Fynn toward Altair, passed through those same forests several hours after the Black Knights had moved on. They were traveling by moonlight, avoiding main roads where Imperial patrols might catch them, following routes known only to locals who had hunted these woods for generations. Minwu, the White Wizard, sensed something as they moved through an area strewn with bodies. Not the presence of the dead, which unfortunately permeated every path they traveled, but something else. The faintest flicker of life force, so weak it barely registered, but undeniably present. They found Firion first, lying in a pool of his own blood, a wound across his chest that should have killed him within minutes. But the wound, while grievous, had somehow missed anything immediately vital, and he still drew shallow, rasping breaths that suggested his body was fighting desperately to maintain whatever tenuous grip on life remained. Maria was nearby, similarly wounded and barely conscious, her survival equally improbable. Guy's massive frame had perhaps saved him, his body able to absorb punishment that would have killed someone smaller, though he too hovered at death's threshold. Only Leon was missing from the scene, his body nowhere to be found among the dead. No sign of what had become of him in the chaos. Minwu immediately began working healing magic, channeling his power into the 3 dying youths. knitting wounds that had nearly bled them dry, stabilizing bodies that had begun the process of shutting down. The magic was powerful but draining, each healing requiring Minwu to pour his own life force into the recipients, gambling that he could save them before exhausting himself to the point where he could no longer maintain the spell. Princess Hilda helped as she could, providing water to wet their lips, speaking words of encouragement that the unconscious might somehow hear and respond to, offering whatever support could be given by someone without magical ability. The healing took hours. By the time dawn began lightening the eastern sky, Firion, Maria, and Guy had stabilized enough to be moved, though they remained unconscious and would need days of rest and continued treatment before they could be considered truly out of danger. Minwu was exhausted, pale and shaking from the expenditure of so much magical energy, but alive and functional enough to travel. They fashioned stretchers from fallen branches and cloaks, and the small party continued south toward Altair, now carrying 3 additional members who might or might not survive the journey. Leon's absence haunted Maria, even in her unconscious state. She murmured his name during fevered dreams, reaching out for a brother who was not there, her subconscious recognizing that something fundamental had been torn away even before her conscious mind could process the loss. Princess Hilda's people searched the area as thoroughly as time allowed, looking for any sign of what had happened to the 4th youth, but found nothing. No body, no blood trail leading away, no evidence of whether he had escaped or been captured or been killed, and his corpse removed for some inscrutable imperial purpose. The mystery of Leon's fate would have to wait. The living required attention, and the rebellion needed every survivor they could save if there was to be any hope of mounting real resistance against the Empire. The party continued south, moving as quickly as the wounded allowed, always watching for Imperial patrols, finally reaching Altair as the sun reached its zenith on the day after Fynn's fall. Altair was smaller than Fynn, but well situated, surrounded by mountains that made approach difficult and provided natural defenses against casual assault. The town had so far avoided Imperial attention, being neither wealthy enough to be valuable nor threatening enough to be prioritized for conquest. It would serve as the rebellion's temporary headquarters, a place to gather survivors, plan resistance, and begin the long, desperate work of opposing an empire that seemed destined to swallow the world. They brought Firion, Maria, and Guy to the town's small castle, formerly the residence of a minor noble who had pledged support to Princess Hilda's cause. Rooms were prepared, soft beds instead of forest floor, warm blankets and hot meals instead of exposure and starvation. Minwu continued his healing work, supplementing magic with herbs and traditional medicine, monitoring their recovery with the careful attention of someone who understood how close they had come to permanent death. Days passed. The 3 youths slowly recovered, consciousness returning in gradual stages, confusion giving way to memory, and memory bringing with it the full weight of what they had lost. Their home was destroyed. Their parents were dead, killed in the initial assault, or the chaos that followed. Their brother and friend Leon was missing. Fate unknown, but likely terrible, given that no good explanation existed for why he alone had not been found with the others. They woke to a world transformed, everything familiar stripped away, leaving only the raw framework of existence, survival, grief, and the question of what comes next when everything that gave life meaning has been taken. Firion woke first, his eyes opening to see an unfamiliar ceiling, his body aching in ways that suggested recent severe injury, even though the wounds themselves had been healed. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, pain shooting through his torso, and a gentle hand pressed him back down. "Easy," Minwu said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of healers who have seen too much suffering. "You nearly died. Your body needs time to recover, even though magic has closed the wounds." Questions tumbled through Firion's mind faster than he could articulate them. Where was he? How long had he been unconscious? What happened after the Black Knights attacked? Where were Maria and Guy? Where was Leon? The last question, as it formed, brought with it a cascade of traumatic memory. The fight, the blades, Leon standing between them and death, and then nothing. Darkness and pain, and the sense of falling into something vast and cold from which return seemed impossible. "Your friends are alive," Minwu said, anticipating at least some of the questions. "Maria and Guy are in the next rooms, also recovering. You're in Altair, under the protection of Princess Hilda. You've been unconscious for 3 days." "Leon?" Firion managed to croak, his throat raw from disuse. Minwu's expression shifted, sympathy and regret mixing in ways that communicated terrible news before words could. "We don't know. He wasn't with you when we found you in the forest. We searched but found no trace. I'm sorry." The weight of that uncertainty was somehow worse than confirmation of death would have been. If Leon was dead, they could mourn. If he was alive, they could hope for reunion. Caught between the two, they could only exist in the liminal space of not knowing, imagining worst possible fates while clinging to increasingly implausible scenarios where their brother had somehow escaped and would return to them. Maria took the news hardest when she woke the following day. She refused to accept that Leon might be dead, insisting that she would know, that she would feel it if her brother had been killed, that the bond between them was too strong to be severed without her sensing the loss. She demanded they return to the forest, search more thoroughly, find evidence one way or the other. When told that returning to the area was impossible due to Imperial patrols and that the rebellion could not spare resources for what was likely a futile search, she threatened to go alone, her grief transmuting into anger at everyone and everything that stood between her and answers about her brother's fate. Guy, when he recovered consciousness, said little. He had always been a man of few words, his upbringing among animals leaving him less comfortable with human language, and grief rendered him even more silent. He sat with Maria when she needed companionship, stood beside Firion when physical support was required, but mostly he simply existed in the quiet space of mourning for family lost and uncertain. They recovered slowly over the following week, physical wounds healing faster than emotional ones, mobility returning even as purpose remained unclear. What were they supposed to do now? Everything that had defined their existence was gone. They had no home to return to, no family to reunite with, no obvious path forward into a future that seemed to offer only more loss and suffering. They were alive, but survival without meaning is its own form of death, and the three of them drifted through days in the castle at Altair feeling more like ghosts than living people. Princess Hilda watched them during this period, noting their recovery, their dynamic, the way they clung to each other as the only familiar things in a world that had become utterly alien. She saw in them something the rebellion desperately needed, people young enough to learn quickly, strong enough to fight, and motivated by losses so profound that they might channel their grief into action rather than letting it consume them. When Minwu reported that they were physically recovered enough to leave bed and begin moving around the castle, she decided it was time to speak with them. They met in the throne room, a formal space that seemed too grand for the small rebellion it now housed. Princess Hilda sat in a chair that was merely a chair rather than a true throne, her bearing regal despite the modest circumstances, her expression carrying both sympathy and the harder edges of someone who had already made difficult choices and would make many more before this conflict ended. "I am glad to see you recovered," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "Minwu tells me you're likely to make full recoveries, which is something of a miracle given your condition when we found you." "Thank you for saving us," Firion replied, speaking for the group as he often did. We don't remember much after the Black Knights attacked, only waking up here." "You were very nearly dead," Hilda said bluntly. "Another hour and you would have been beyond even Minwu's ability to help. You were fortunate that we passed through that area when we did." "We're grateful," Maria added, though her voice carried the hollow quality of someone going through motions of politeness while their mind remained elsewhere. "Has there been any word about my brother, about Leon?" Hilda's expression softened with sympathy. "Nothing yet. I'm sorry. We've had scouts searching, questioning refugees, following every possible lead. But with the chaos following, Fynn's fall and Imperial patrols everywhere, information is scarce and often unreliable. If he was captured, he might be held in Palamecia. If he escaped, he might be hiding somewhere, afraid to reveal himself. We simply don't know." The answer was honest but unhelpful, and Maria's face showed the struggle between accepting reality and clinging to hope. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the information without accepting its implications. "What happens to us now?" Firion asked. "We can't return to Fynn. We have nowhere else to go." "That depends on you," Hilda said. "You're welcome to remain in Altair as refugees. We'll provide shelter and food, safety to the extent we can offer it. Many survivors from Fynn are here, trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life despite everything they've lost." "But," Firion prompted, hearing the unspoken continuation. "But there is another option," Hilda continued. "You could join us, join the Wild Rose Rebellion, help us fight against the Empire, work toward eventually retaking Fynn and stopping the conquest that has already claimed too many kingdoms. It would be dangerous, possibly fatal, but it would be purposeful." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Firion felt the pull of it immediately, the promise of action instead of passive survival, the opportunity to direct his grief and anger towards something that might actually matter. Guy's expression remained unreadable as always, but he watched Maria, clearly prepared to support whatever decision she made. Maria herself seemed torn, part of her wanting to join, to fight, to do something, but another part unable to move forward, while Leon's fate remained unknown. "We're not soldiers," Firion said, acknowledging the obvious objection. We were just ordinary people. We don't know how to fight, don't have military training. What use would we be?" "You're alive," Hilda said simply. "That makes you more useful than the countless others who aren't. The rebellion doesn't need perfect soldiers. It needs people willing to fight despite the risk, willing to learn what they need to know, willing to stand against tyranny even when victory seems impossible. If you have that willingness, I can teach you the rest." "And if we fail?" Maria asked. "If we join you and die in some mission gone wrong, what will have been the point?" "The point," Hilda said, her voice hardening slightly, "is that some things are worth dying for. Freedom, justice, the belief that ordinary people deserve to live without terror of monsters and tyrants. I won't lie to you about the risks. Many who join the rebellion don't survive long, but at least they die fighting for something rather than simply waiting for the Empire to finish grinding them down. At least their deaths mean something. The three youths looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them through expressions and slight nods. They had already died once in those woods outside Fynn, already experienced the dissolution of self that comes when blood loss reaches critical levels and consciousness begins to fade. Coming back from that threshold had given them a strange perspective, a recognition that the time they had now was borrowed, a gift they had no inherent right to, but which had been given anyway through the intervention of strangers who saw worth in saving them. "I'll join," Firion said finally. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left just surviving. If I'm going to live, I want it to mean something." "And I'll join," Guy added, his words simple but carrying weight of certainty. "The Empire killed our family. Can't let that stand." Maria was quiet longer, her internal struggle visible in her conflicted expression. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but determined. "I'll join, but I won't stop looking for Leon. And if we find him, if he's alive somewhere, I'm going to bring him home no matter what it takes." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Hilda said, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Very well. You're now members of the Wild Rose Rebellion. Before we begin your training, there's something you need to know. A password that identifies us to each other and allows us to move safely through territory we control. The password is Wild Rose. Speak it to the right people and doors will open. Speak it to the wrong people and you'll likely be captured or killed, so use it carefully." "Wild Rose," the three repeated, committing the words to memory. "Good," Hilda said. "Now, about your brother. I said we don't know Leon's fate, but there is one place we haven't been able to search properly. Fynn itself. The Empire controls the city now, and our scouts can't move freely there. But someone who knows the city well, who could navigate it despite Imperial presence, might be able to discover information about what happened to missing residents. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but if you're determined to find answers..." "We'll go," Firion said immediately. "We know Fynn better than anyone in your rebellion. If there's any chance Leon's there, any information about what happened to him, we'll find it." Princess Hilda recognized the determination in their eyes, the particular quality of resolve that comes from people who have already lost everything and now have only purpose to sustain them. Their first mission would be a return to the ruins of what had been home, a journey into Imperial-occupied territory where every shadow might conceal an enemy and every familiar street now carried the weight of occupation. She explained that Prince Scott of Kashwan, her betrothed and a key figure in the defense of Fynn, had been wounded during the retreat and separated from the main body of survivors. Reports suggested he had made it into the city itself, seeking shelter in places he knew from his visits to the kingdom. But nothing had been confirmed since the Empire completed its conquest. The three youths prepared for the journey with the careful attention of people who understood that poor preparation meant death. They took weapons offered by the rebellion, simple swords and a bow that felt foreign in hands that had never held such implements with serious intent. Guy's massive frame suited him for a large axe, its weight and reach allowing him to leverage his natural strength into devastating blows once he learned the fundamentals of its use. Minwu provided basic instruction in their use, demonstrating stances and strikes, explaining that real combat was nothing like the heroic tales suggested, that it was ugly and chaotic and required them to act on instinct rather than thought when violence erupted. They left Altair at dawn, moving north through terrain that grew increasingly familiar as they approached Fynn. The journey took most of a day. their progress slowed by the need to avoid Imperial patrols and the main roads where Palamecian soldiers moved freely between conquered territories. They saw evidence of the occupation everywhere. Supply caravans heading toward Fynn, groups of prisoners being marched in chains toward unknown destinations, mounted knights sweeping the countryside for refugees who might be hiding in forests or remote villages. The city itself appeared first as smoke on the horizon, the acrid smell of burning that had not ceased even days after the initial conquest. As they drew closer, moving through the same forests where they had nearly died, the full extent of Fynn's transformation became visible. The outer walls still stood, but were manned now by Imperial soldiers in their distinctive black armor. The gates hung open, the defensive portcullises destroyed during the assault, the mechanisms that would have allowed them to be lowered again, reduced to twisted metal and broken chains. They entered through a section of wall that had partially collapsed, scrambling over rubble while watching for patrols. The city within was almost unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood for generations were now hollow shells, their contents looted or destroyed, their walls blackened by fires that had raged unchecked during the conquest. Bodies still lay in some streets, residents who had died in the fighting or the chaos that followed, their corpses left where they fell as warnings or simply because the living had more pressing concerns than proper burial of the dead. Imperial soldiers were everywhere, their presence transforming the geography of the city into zones of control and danger. They moved in groups of 3 or 4, weapons drawn, watching the few remaining civilians with suspicion that could turn violent at the slightest provocation. The residents who remained, those too old or young or stubborn to flee during the evacuation, moved through their own city like ghosts, heads down, avoiding eye contact with the occupiers, trying to become invisible in hopes that invisibility might equal survival. Firion, Maria, and Guy moved through this nightmare landscape with the careful stealth of people who understood that discovery meant immediate death. They knew Fynn's layout intimately, knew which alleys connected to which streets, which buildings had basements that opened onto the old smuggling tunnels that predated current memory, which routes the City Watch had traditionally patrolled, and which the new Imperial occupiers might therefore favor. This knowledge, purchased through years of living in the city, now served as their primary advantage against an enemy that possessed superior numbers and equipment, but lacked familiarity with every hidden corner and forgotten passage. They made their way toward the sections of the city where the resistance had established safe houses before the conquest, places where sympathizers might shelter rebels or fugitives fleeing imperial persecution. Most were compromised now, marked by the bodies of their former occupants hanging from posts or simply abandoned after their residents fled or were captured. But a few remained, identifiable by subtle markings that only those who knew what to look for would recognize. Symbols carved into door frames or specific arrangements of flowers in windows that signaled safety or danger depending on their configuration. At one such location, a modest home in a district that had suffered less damage than others, they found an elderly woman who had chosen to remain despite the occupation. Her face showed the accumulated exhaustion of someone living under constant threat, every knock on the door potentially bringing Imperial soldiers. Every day survived a minor miracle that might not repeat itself tomorrow. She recognized the 3 youths from before the conquest, knew them as children of respected families, and the sight of them alive brought tears to eyes that had seen too much death to easily accommodate joy. She told them what she knew of Prince Scott's fate in whispers that barely carried across the room. her fear of Imperial discovery making her voice nearly inaudible. The prince had indeed made it into Fynn during the retreat, badly wounded but alive, seeking shelter in the network of resistance safe houses. He had stayed at several locations as his injuries were treated, and as the Imperial net drew tighter around the city. The last she had heard, he had gone to ground in the outskirts, in a small house near the northern edge of the city, where a merchant sympathetic to the rebellion had agreed to hide him until recovery allowed escape. They thanked her and left before their presence could endanger her further, making their way through back alleys toward the northern district. The afternoon was wearing into evening as they approached the location she had described, a small residence that appeared abandoned from the street, its windows dark and its door hanging slightly ajar in a way that suggested either hasty departure or violent entry. The three youths approached cautiously, weapons drawn, expecting an Imperial trap or evidence of another tragedy to add to the uncounted others this city had already witnessed. They found Prince Scott in the back room of the house, lying on a simple cot, his chest wrapped in bandages that had been white once, but were now stained brown with old blood and yellow with infection. He was conscious but feverish, his eyes glassy with pain and delirium, his breathing labored and irregular in ways that suggested damage beyond simple sword wounds. The merchant who had sheltered him was gone, fled or captured or killed, leaving the prince alone with injuries that were slowly killing him and with no means of summoning help or reaching safety on his own power. Firion knelt beside the cot, touching Scott's shoulder gently to announce their presence without startling him. The prince's eyes focused with difficulty, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to relief so profound, it seemed to drain what little strength remained to him. His lips moved, forming words that took several attempts to vocalize, his voice barely more than a whisper, each word clearly costing him tremendous effort. Princess Hilda's name emerged first. Questions about whether she had escaped, whether she was safe, whether the rebellion had survived the fall of Fynn. Firion assured him that Hilda lived, that she had established a base in Altair, that the resistance continued despite all losses. The news brought something like peace to Scott's face, the relief of knowing that the woman he loved had survived even as his own life drained away in this abandoned house. Then came information, words forced out with desperate urgency, understanding that time was running short and what he knew needed to reach Princess Hilda before death silenced him permanently. He spoke of betrayal, of General Borgen, who had commanded Kashuan's forces at Fynn. Borgen had seemed a loyal ally during the defense, his troops fighting alongside Finn's soldiers, his tactical decisions sound, and his courage apparent. But Scott had discovered the truth too late to act on it, had learned in the chaotic hours of Finn's fall that Borgen had been secretly negotiating with the Empire, had agreed to sabotage the defense in exchange for position and power under Imperial rule. The betrayal explained much about how Fynn had fallen so quickly, how defensive positions had collapsed at critical moments, how Imperial forces had known exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Borgen had provided intelligence to the enemy, had positioned his own troops to fail at key junctures, had ensured that coordination between allied forces broke down when it mattered most. He was directly responsible for hundreds of deaths, for the kingdom's fall, for the success of an invasion that might have been repelled or at least delayed if the defenders had been able to trust all of their supposed allies. Scott spoke of Borgen's current position as well, information gathered from overheard conversations during his time hiding in the occupied city. The traitor had been rewarded for his service to the Empire with governorship of a town called Gatrea, a strategic location that controlled access to mountain passes leading toward regions not yet under imperial control. He lived there now in comfort, purchased with the blood of his former allies, protected by imperial soldiers, and doubtless already planning whatever next betrayal would advance his position in the new order. The prince's voice grew weaker as he spoke, the effort of communication draining reserves that were already critically depleted. He tried to say more, perhaps about his brother Gordon, perhaps final messages for Princess Hilda, but the words dissolved into unintelligible murmuring and then into silence. His chest rose and fell one final time, a rattling exhalation that carried with it whatever remained of Prince Scott of Kashwan, leaving behind only a body that had fought as long as biology allowed before accepting the inevitable. Maria closed his eyes with gentle fingers, affording him what dignity could be offered in death, even when circumstances prevented any proper ceremony or burial. They could not carry his body from Fynn, could not risk the weight and visibility that transport would entail. The best they could offer was to cover him with the blanket from the cot and to mark his location in memory so that someday, if the rebellion succeeded, if Fynn was retaken and imperial occupation ended, his remains could be recovered and given the honors due a prince who had fought and died for freedom. They left the house as darkness completed its claim on the city, moving through streets that became more dangerous after sunset, when imperial soldiers implemented strict curfews and killed anyone found outside without authorization. The journey back to the collapsed section of wall felt longer than it had in daylight. Every sound magnified, every shadow potentially concealing enemies. They made it through only because they knew the city better than its occupiers, because desperation made them careful and fear made them silent. They reached Altair late that night, exhausted and grieving, carrying news that Princess Hilda needed to hear but would devastate her to receive. She met them in the throne room despite the late hour, still awake, always awake these days, sleep being a luxury that leadership could not afford, when every hour brought new crises requiring decision and action. Her face, when they told her of Scott's death, showed grief so profound that for a moment the strong leader disappeared and only the woman remained, someone who had lost her betrothed and her kingdom and was being asked to continue functioning despite both losses. But the moment passed quickly because it had to, because grief was another luxury that current circumstances would not permit. She wept briefly, allowing herself that much, and then she set her grief aside to be processed later or never, returning to the role that her position demanded. She listened to everything Scott had told them, her expression hardening as she learned of Borgen's betrayal, anger displacing sorrow as she understood how many deaths could be laid at his feet. The information about Borgen changed the rebellion's immediate priorities. He possessed intelligence about resistance operations, new identities of sympathizers and locations of safe houses, carried knowledge that could devastate what remained of the rebel network if the Empire properly exploited what he knew. Moreover, his betrayal demanded response, both for justice and to send a message that traitors would be held accountable regardless of imperial protection. Princess Hilda declared that Borgen must be dealt with, captured or killed, his betrayal exposed and punished before he could cause further damage. But the mission to Gatrea would require better equipment than the rebellion currently possessed. The weapons they had were adequate for basic defense, but insufficient for the kind of infiltration and combat that confronting Borgen would demand. Princess Hilda spoke of mithril, a legendary metal said to possess properties that made it vastly superior to conventional steel. Weapons and armor forged from mithril could stand against Imperial equipment on equal terms, could provide the rebels with tools that might partially offset their numerical disadvantage. A source of mithril existed at Summit Falls, a location in the mountains north of Altair, where mineral deposits of exceptional quality had been discovered years before. The falls were dangerous to reach, and the mining was difficult, but the reward was material that could fundamentally improve the rebellion's capabilities. Princess Hilda tasked Firion, Maria, and Guy with journeying to Summit Falls, making contact with the miners there, and securing enough mithril to outfit the rebellion's core fighters with superior equipment. The journey to Summit Falls took them through mountain passes, where snow fell even in summer, through terrain that tested their still developing skills and endurance. They were stronger now than when they had first joined the rebellion, their bodies adapting to constant physical demands, their combat abilities improving through practice, and the occasional skirmish with monsters that infested the wilderness between settled areas. The world had always contained monsters, creatures spawned from magical energy, or simply animals grown twisted and dangerous through means not fully understood. But the Emperor's opening of the Jade Passage had dramatically increased their numbers and aggression. They fought goblins in the mountain passes, small humanoid creatures that attacked in groups, using crude weapons but possessing a cunning that made them dangerous despite their individual weakness. They encountered wolves grown to enormous size, their eyes glowing with unnatural intelligence, their fangs capable of tearing through leather armor as though it were cloth. Each battle taught them something new about combat, about working together, about the ugly reality of violence that bore no resemblance to heroic narratives where the righteous triumphed through virtue alone. Summit Falls revealed itself as a thundering cascade of water plunging from heights that disappeared into mist and clouds above, the roar of its descent drowning out all other sounds, the spray creating perpetual rainbows in sunlight that penetrated the mountain valley. Near the base of the falls, carved into the rock itself, they found the mining settlement, a collection of rough structures housing workers who extracted mithril from deposits exposed by the fall's erosive power over centuries. The settlement was in crisis. Imperial forces had reached this remote location, not in conquest, but in exploitation, seeking the same mithril that made Summit Falls valuable to the rebellion. They had not destroyed the mining operation, but had instead enslaved its workers, forcing them to extract mithril for Imperial use, while treating them with the casual brutality that characterized Palamecia's approach to any population that could not effectively resist. The miners worked under constant guard, their families held hostage to ensure cooperation, their lives reduced to extraction and survival with no hope of escape or liberation. Among those imprisoned at Summit Falls was Joseph, a man whose reputation preceded him in whispered stories told throughout the resistance network. He was from Salamand, a town that had resisted Imperial occupation longer than most, whose residents had fought with particular fierceness before being overwhelmed and scattered. Joseph himself was a figure of considerable physical power, a man who worked with his hands and whose strength came not from training, but from decades of labor that had shaped his body into something formidable. He had a daughter, Nellie, whose safety was the lever the Empire used to ensure his compliance, and a wife who had died during Salamand's fall, leaving him with only his child as motivation to continue living. Firion, Maria, and Guy observed the mining operation from concealment, assessing the situation, counting Imperial guards, and evaluating the difficulty of liberation. The guards were numerous but not alert, their confidence in the settlement's isolation and the hostages' presence making them complacent. A plan formed through whispered consultation. They would strike at night when guard rotations were changing and visibility was poorest, targeting the barracks first to prevent reinforcements from reaching the mine itself, then moving to free the workers before Imperial response could be organized. The attack unfolded in darkness with the roar of the falls masking the sounds of combat. Firion and Guy struck the barracks, their weapons cutting through sleeping soldiers before alarm could be raised, their movements quick and ruthless in ways they would have found unthinkable weeks earlier, but which now felt like grim necessity. Maria positioned herself to intercept any guards fleeing toward the alarm bell, her arrows finding targets in the darkness with accuracy born from desperate practice. Joseph and the other miners, recognizing the opportunity, turned on their remaining guards with improvised weapons and raw fury. Picks and hammers designed for extracting ore from stone proved equally effective at cracking armor and breaking bones when wielded by men who had been waiting for any chance at revenge. The guards fell quickly, overwhelmed by numbers and surprise, their training meaning little when ambushed by people they had grown accustomed to treating as helpless. When the violence ended and silence returned save for the eternal thunder of the falls, Joseph stood among the bodies of Imperial soldiers and breathed free air for the first time in weeks. His gratitude to the three youths was profound and immediate, expressed not in words, but in the fierce embrace of someone who understood they had been given back their life and their daughter's future. The mithril they sought was theirs freely, as much as they could carry. Payment for liberation that no amount of metal could truly compensate. Joseph insisted on accompanying them back to Altair, bringing not just mithril, but information about Imperial operations in the region and volunteers from among the freed miners who were willing to join the rebellion. The journey back was slower with the larger group, but safer, their increased numbers deterring the monsters that might have attacked a smaller party. They reached Altair to find Princess Hilda pleased not just with the mithril, but with the new recruits, each addition to the rebellion's ranks representing hope that they might achieve something beyond simple survival. The blacksmiths of Altair worked the mithril into weapons and armor that gleamed with subtle iridescence, metal that seemed to drink light and reflect it back in shifted spectrums. Firion received a sword that balanced perfectly in his hand, its edge capable of cutting through Imperial steel in ways that ordinary weapons could not match. Guy's axe was reforged with mithril reinforcement, transforming it from heavy tool into lethal implement. Maria's bow and arrows gained new potency, the mithril allowing for greater draw weight and penetration. Armed with these superior weapons and accompanied by Joseph and several other volunteers, the party prepared to confront Borgen in Gatrea. The journey south took them through territories increasingly under Imperial control, requiring careful navigation and frequent concealment to avoid patrols. Gatrea itself was a fortified town, its walls intact and well defended, its garrison substantial enough to suggest the Empire considered it strategically important beyond its immediate tactical value. Borgen lived in the town's manor house, a structure that had once belonged to the local nobility before they fled or were killed during the conquest. He had made himself comfortable there, enjoying luxuries that Imperial favor provided, insulated from the consequences of his betrayal by walls and guards, and the general chaos that prevented proper investigation of who had done what during Fynn's fall. He believed himself secure beyond reach of retribution, protected by the same overwhelming force that had crushed the kingdoms he had helped conquer. The infiltration of Gatrea required patience and careful timing. They could not simply fight their way to Borgen through a garrisoned town, could not hope to survive the response that open assault would provoke. Instead, they waited and watched, learning patrol patterns, identifying weak points in the town's defenses, finding ways to move undetected through streets where Imperial soldiers walked openly and residents kept indoors after dark. They entered Borgen's manor through a servant's entrance that saw little traffic after sunset, moving through kitchens and storage areas toward the upper floors where the traitor maintained his private quarters. They encountered servants who saw them but did not raise alarm, who understood that whatever was happening tonight was not their concern, and that survival meant seeing nothing and remembering less. The household staff of collaborators learned quickly that invisibility served better than loyalty when occupiers clashed with rebels, and both were equally capable of killing those who interfered. They found Borgen in his study, reviewing documents by lamplight, his features showing none of the guilt or conscience that his actions might have warranted. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to fear in the span of heartbeats. He reached for a sword hanging on the wall behind his desk, but Firion crossed the distance before the weapon could be drawn, his mithril blade's point coming to rest against Borgen's throat with just enough pressure to draw a bead of blood. The traitor's face, as he realized who confronted him, showed the particular terror of someone meeting consequences they had convinced themselves would never arrive. He tried words, attempted explanations and justifications, offered bribes and promises, sought any avenue that might preserve his life. But there was nothing he could say that would erase what he had done, no compensation sufficient for the deaths his betrayal had caused. Joseph stepped forward then, his massive hands closing around Borgen's head with careful precision, and with a single sharp motion snapped the traitor's neck. The body slumped in the chair, eyes still open, face frozen in the final moment of understanding that justice, however delayed, had finally found him. They left him there for Imperial forces to find, a message that collaborators were not safe even behind enemy lines, that the rebellion could reach anyone regardless of protection or position. The escape from Gatrea was chaotic, their presence discovered by servants who found courage once they realized what had happened, alarm bells ringing through the town as Imperial soldiers mobilized. They fought running battles through streets that became increasingly crowded with enemies, their mithril weapons allowing them to stand against superior numbers long enough to break through defensive cordons and reach the town's edge. Not everyone made it out. 2 of the volunteers from Salamand fell in the fighting, their sacrifice buying time for the others to escape into the darkness beyond the walls. They returned to Altair as the sun rose, exhausted and bloodied but alive, having struck a significant blow against the Empire and its collaborators. Princess Hilda received the news of Borgen's death with grim satisfaction, acknowledging that while it could not undo the damage he had caused, at least he would cause no more. The rebellion had demonstrated that it could strike Imperial interests even in occupied territory, that walls and guards were not sufficient protection against determined opponents who understood the moral clarity of their cause. But celebrations were brief because the war continued, and the Empire's attention was increasingly turning toward Altair itself. Princess Hilda received intelligence that Imperial forces were preparing something significant, a weapon or strategy that would allow them to crush the rebellion before it could gather sufficient strength to pose real threat to Palamecian dominance. The nature of this threat remained unclear, but its existence was undeniable, and preparing to counter it became the rebellion's primary focus. Word came from Bafsk, a town to the west that maintained tenuous independence through geography and luck. that Imperial forces were gathering there in unusual numbers. Scouts reported construction of some kind, massive projects that required resources and labor on a scale that suggested something beyond simple fortification. Princess Hilda needed eyes on the situation, reliable intelligence about what the Empire was building and how it might threaten the rebellion's survival. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Joseph traveled to Bavsk, moving carefully through territories that were becoming increasingly dangerous as Imperial control tightened and random encounters with patrols grew more frequent. The town itself appeared normal at first, its walls intact and its residents moving about their daily business, but closer observation revealed tension beneath the surface, a fear that permeated every interaction and gesture. They learned through careful questioning and observation that the Empire was indeed building something at Bavsk, a project so ambitious that its nature defied easy explanation. Workers spoke in whispers of a massive airship, a flying fortress powered by magic and steam, capable of carrying troops and weapons across distances that would take weeks to traverse by foot. The dreadnought, they called it, an engine of war that would allow the Empire to strike anywhere without warning, to bypass defensive positions and assault targets that had believed themselves safe behind mountains or distance. The dreadnought was still under construction, but nearing completion, its massive hull visible in the shipyard that had been built specifically to house the project. It dwarfed anything else in Bavsk, its shadow covering multiple city blocks, its presence both awesome and terrible in what it represented. When it launched, when it took to the skies with Imperial forces aboard, no place would be truly safe from Palamecian reach. They returned to Altair with this intelligence, and Princess Hilda immediately recognized the existential threat the dreadnought represented. The rebellion could not allow such a weapon to become operational, could not permit the Empire to achieve the kind of mobility and striking power that an airship of that size would provide. But destroying something as massive and well-guarded as the dreadnought, while it remained at Bavsk, was impossible. The shipyard was too heavily defended, the forces too numerous, the risks too great. Then came worse news. The dreadnought had launched ahead of schedule, its construction accelerated by Imperial command, its maiden voyage beginning before the rebellion could formulate any response. Reports arrived of towns destroyed by bombardment from above, of populations slaughtered by troops deployed directly from the flying fortress, of defensive positions rendered meaningless when the enemy could simply fly over them. The dreadnought moved across the landscape like a storm, leaving devastation in its wake, demonstrating the new reality of warfare where the Empire could strike anywhere with impunity. Princess Hilda called an emergency council of the rebellion's leadership, gathering everyone whose insight might contribute to solving an apparently unsolvable problem. Among those present was Prince Gordon of Kashwan, Scott's younger brother, who had made his way to Altair after Fynn's fall, seeking any way to contribute despite his overwhelming guilt over his failure during the battle. Gordon was not a warrior like his brother had been, was not brave or confident, or naturally suited for the kind of desperate resistance the rebellion demanded. But he was intelligent and capable of careful planning, and his knowledge of his homeland might prove valuable. The council debated options for hours, each proposal dismissed as unfeasible or suicidal, the growing sense that they faced a threat they could not counter, leading toward despair. Then Gordon spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an idea that might just possibly work. In Kashwan, there existed a legendary artifact called the Sunfire, a magical device created by ancient civilizations, capable of generating heat intense enough to melt stone. It had been kept in Kashwan's treasury for generations, more curiosity than weapon. But if someone could retrieve it and figure out how to use it against the dreadnought, it might damage the airship's engines or structural integrity enough to bring it down. The plan was desperate and relied on numerous assumptions that might prove false, but it was better than nothing. The only suggestion that offered any hope of addressing the threat. The Sunfire was kept in Kashwan Keep, a fortress in the mountains that had so far resisted Imperial conquest through the difficulty of its terrain and the determination of its remaining defenders. Getting there, securing the Sunfire, and then somehow using it against a flying fortress were each individually difficult tasks that together seemed almost impossible. But possible, however barely, remained preferable to certain defeat. Gordon volunteered to lead the expedition to Kashwan Keep, partly because he knew the fortress and its defenders, partly because he desperately needed to prove to himself that he was not the coward his flight from Fynn had made him feel himself to be. Firion, Maria, and Guy would accompany him, along with Joseph and several other experienced fighters. Princess Hilda would remain in Altair to coordinate the rebellion's other operations and to maintain leadership presence in case the mission failed and killed everyone involved. The journey to Kashwan Keep took them through mountain passes where snow lay deep even in summer, through territory contested by Imperial forces and local resistance fighters who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. They encountered refugees fleeing the dreadnought's attacks, entire villages displaced by bombardment from above, survivors with stories of death raining from the sky without warning or mercy. The reports confirmed what they already knew. The dreadnought had to be stopped, whatever the cost. Kashwan Keep rose from the mountains like an extension of the stone itself, its walls carved from living rock, its defenses incorporating natural features that made assault nearly impossible for conventional forces. The defenders recognized Gordon and granted them entry, though their faces showed the accumulated exhaustion of people who had been fighting too long with too few resources and no real hope of ultimate victory. The keep had not fallen, because taking it would cost more than the Empire was currently willing to pay. But everyone knew that eventually the calculation would shift, and when it did, resistance would end. The keep's commander, a grizzled veteran who had served Gordon's father, brought them to the treasury where the Sunfire was kept, along with other artifacts and treasures that represented Kashwan's accumulated wealth and history. The device was smaller than expected, a crystalline sphere mounted in an ornate metal framework, its surface pulsing with internal light that suggested power barely contained. Ancient texts claimed it could focus solar energy into beams of such intensity that they could melt through any material, but no one present had ever seen it used or knew exactly how to activate its power. Gordon studied the device, handling it with care that bordered on reverence, understanding that he held either salvation or simply another false hope. The text mentioned something called Eagle's Torch, a catalyst required to awaken the Sunfire's power, another legendary artifact whose location had been lost to time and whose very existence was uncertain. But legends had to start somewhere, and if the Sunfire was real, perhaps its catalyst was as well. Research in Kashwan Keep's library, consulting what records had survived centuries of warfare and upheaval, pointed toward a frozen cavern in the far north, a place where supposedly a flame burned eternally despite being surrounded by ice. The description matched accounts of Eagle's Torch, the eternal flame that served as key to the Sunfire's power. The location was remote and dangerous, but they had come this far and faced obstacles at least as daunting. Another journey, another risk, another roll of dice against odds that never seemed to improve. They travelled north from Kashwan Keep, into regions where winter never truly released its grip, where snow fell constantly, and cold crept through even the best clothing to settle into bones and sap strength. The cavern they sought was hidden within a glacier, its entrance nearly invisible, marked only by the faint heat shimmer that seemed impossible in such frigid surroundings. Inside, protected from wind but not from cold, they found a chamber where a flame burned without fuel or smoke, without consuming itself or spreading, simply existing as some ancient magic had decreed it should exist until whatever purpose it served was fulfilled. Egil's torch was not a physical object, but the flame itself, its essence needing to be captured rather than carried, its power transferred to the sunfire through processes that the ancient texts only vaguely described. Gordon approached the flame with the sunfire held before him, speaking words from the texts in languages no one alive fully understood, attempting a ritual that might work or might accomplish nothing. The flame responded, its light intensifying, and then it seemed to flow like liquid into the crystalline sphere, the sunfire absorbing Egil's torch, until the chamber went dark, and only the pulsing glow of the charged device remained to light their way back to the surface. They emerged from the frozen cavern with the activated sunfire, its power now ready to be directed against the Empire's flying fortress. But the question remained of how to actually deploy it. The dreadnought did not hover in place waiting to be attacked, did not follow predictable patterns that would allow them to position themselves for a clear strike. They would need to get aboard the airship somehow, penetrate to its interior, and use the sunfire against critical systems while surrounded by Imperial forces who would be highly motivated to prevent exactly that. Word reached them as they journeyed back south that the dreadnought had captured 2 high-value prisoners during a raid on a settlement near Altair. Princess Hilda herself had been taken, along with Sid, an engineer whose knowledge of airships and ancient technology made him valuable to the Empire. Both were being held aboard the dreadnought, likely for interrogation and eventual execution, their capture representing a catastrophic blow to the rebellion's leadership and morale. The news transformed the mission from theoretical attack on a distant target to desperate rescue operation with immediate personal stakes. Princess Hilda could not be left in Imperial hands, could not be allowed to face whatever interrogation techniques the Empire employed on important prisoners. Sid's technical knowledge was valuable, but his life was worth preserving beyond mere utility. The dreadnought had to be infiltrated, the prisoners rescued, and ideally, the airship itself destroyed, all while surrounded by enemies and with no clear plan for escape, even if the initial objectives were somehow achieved. They formulated approach through desperation, rather than careful planning. The dreadnought needed to land periodically to take on supplies and prisoners from the regions it terrorized. Intelligence suggested its next landing would be at Bafsk, the same shipyard where it had been constructed, for resupply and maintenance that could not be conducted while airborne. If they could reach Bafsk before the airship departed, if they could somehow board during the chaos of resupply, they might penetrate the dreadnought's interior and accomplish what seemed impossible from the outside. They reached Bafsk as the dreadnought settled onto its landing cradles, its massive bulk blocking out the sky, its presence transforming the shipyard into something resembling a small city under siege. Supply lines stretched in all directions, workers and soldiers moving with the organized chaos of a major military operation. Everyone focused on their assigned tasks, and therefore less likely to notice a few additional figures moving among them with apparent purpose. Disguised as workers and moving with the confidence of people who belonged, they infiltrated the supply lines and made their way onto the dreadnought itself. The airship's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, engineering spaces and barracks and storage areas, all connected by passages that seemed to follow no logical layout. They moved deeper into the vessel, avoiding patrols and following what vague intelligence they had about prisoner-holding areas. They found Princess Hilda and Cid in separate cells in the dreadnought's brig, guarded but not as heavily as might be expected. The Empire's confidence in their flying fortress making them complacent about security in a prison that flew and could not be reached by conventional forces. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic, the guards falling to mithril weapons before they could sound an alarm, the cell locks yielding to tools Cid himself had designed years before, and whose mechanisms he could defeat even without access to proper equipment. But escape was interrupted by a presence that brought everything to halt. The Dark Knight appeared in the corridor ahead of them, black armor reflecting no light, a massive sword held with casual expertise that suggested skill far beyond what any ordinary soldier could claim. Something about the figure was familiar in ways that defied immediate identification, some quality of stance or movement that triggered recognition without providing its source. Maria knew before the others, some instinct or connection operating beneath conscious thought, causing her to speak a name that seemed impossible even as it left her lips. Leon, their lost brother, missing since the Black Knights attacked them outside Fynn, presumed dead or captured, now standing before them in Imperial armor as one of the enemy's elite warriors. The shock of recognition froze them all, weapons half raised, words dying in throats suddenly too tight to allow speech. The Dark Knight's stance shifted slightly, some minute tell suggesting he recognized them as well, that beneath the armor and the Imperial allegiance, some fragment of the person they had known remained aware of who confronted him. But if recognition brought hesitation, it was brief and ruthlessly suppressed. The Dark Knight attacked without warning, his blade moving with speed that seemed impossible for someone in such heavy armor, each strike calculated to kill or cripple, technique speaking to training that far exceeded what any ordinary soldier received. They defended desperately, mithril weapons meeting the Dark Knight's blade in impacts that sent shockwaves through their arms and jarred their teeth. Maria called to him repeatedly, speaking his name, begging him to remember who he was, pleading with whatever remained of her brother to surface and recognize that he was attacking his own family. But the Dark Knight fought on without response, without mercy, without any indication that her words reached anything human beneath the armor. The battle was brief because it had to be, because sounds of combat would draw additional forces, and they could not hope to survive if trapped aboard the dreadnought, with its full garrison alerted. Firion managed to land a blow that staggered the Dark Knight, buying precious seconds for the group to retreat, pulling Maria away despite her protests, dragging Princess Hilda and Cid toward the engineering section, where the Sunfire might accomplish what they had come to do. The Dark Knight did not pursue, whether from injury or choice remaining unclear, his armored figure standing in the corridor watching them flee until they turned a corner and lost sight of him. Maria's anguish at leaving Leon behind, at failing to reach him or convince him to abandon the Empire, was a physical thing that seemed to drain her strength and cloud her judgment. Guy had to practically carry her for several corridors before she recovered enough to move under her own power, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with the violence of emotions too large to contain. They reached the dreadnought's engine room, a vast chamber filled with machinery that combined ancient magical mechanisms with more modern steam-powered systems, the whole assemblage working in coordinated complexity to keep the massive airship aloft and mobile. Cid, despite his recent imprisonment, immediately began analyzing the systems, identifying critical points where damage would cascade through the interconnected mechanisms and potentially cripple the entire vessel. Gordon positioned the Sunfire according to Cid's instructions, aiming it at a juncture where multiple power conduits met, a nexus that distributed energy to various systems throughout the ship. The activation was simple once you understood the principle. Expose the crystalline sphere to light, and it would amplify and focus that light into beams of such intensity that they could melt through almost any material. The chamber's ambient illumination was sufficient to trigger the effect, and suddenly the Sunfire blazed with power. A beam of focused solar energy burning through metal and crystal alike, severing connections and melting through structures that had seemed impervious to conventional damage. Alarms began blaring throughout the dreadnought as systems failed and damage reports flooded the command center. The airship shuddered as its engines lost power, the delicate balance of forces that kept it airborne disrupted by the sudden loss of critical systems. The floor tilted as the vessel began to list, its nose dropping, altitude decreasing as magic and mechanics alike failed to maintain its impossible suspension above the earth. They ran through corridors that were now sloped at angles that made movement difficult, past panicking crew members more concerned with saving themselves than stopping intruders, toward the exterior hatches that represented their only hope of escape before the dreadnought completed its transformation from flying fortress to plummeting tomb. Behind them, secondary explosions bloomed as the damage spread, magical energies interacting with steam systems in ways that created cascading failures, each one accelerating the airship's descent. They reached an exterior hatch as the dreadnought dropped below the height, where jumping would mean certain death, the ground still too far below for safe landing, but close enough that survival was possible for those willing to risk broken bones over assured immolation in the crash. They leaped one by one into open air, falling through space that seemed to stretch infinitely, striking ground that was harder than anticipated despite attempts to roll with the impact. The dreadnought hit the earth behind them seconds later, its massive hull plowing through the landscape like a meteor, tearing a trench in the ground hundreds of feet long before friction and structural collapse brought it to rest. The impact crushed the forward sections completely, reduced middle compartments to mangled wreckage, left only the rear sections partially intact. Fires erupted along the length of the wreck, fed by magical energies and conventional fuels, smoke rising in columns visible for miles, a beacon announcing the end of the Empire's proudest weapon. They limped away from the crash site, bruised and battered but alive, Princess Hilda and Cid rescued, and the dreadnought destroyed. But the victory felt hollow to Maria, who had found her brother only to lose him again, who had seen Leon transformed into something that served the Empire and seemed to have forgotten or forsaken everything that had once connected them. She spoke little on the journey back to Altair, her silence heavy with grief that had no outlet and questions that had no answers. The destruction of the dreadnought reverberated across the Empire's territories, demonstrating that even the mightiest Imperial weapons could be brought down, that the rebellion possessed both the capability and the determination to strike significant blows regardless of risk. But it also brought consequences. The Empire's attention now fully focused on Altair and the resistance it harbored, resources being marshaled for a response that would crush this irritation once and for all. Word came that the King of Fynn had died in Imperial custody, his execution announced as punishment for rebellion and warning to others who might consider resistance. With his death, the legitimate royal line had ended, leaving Princess Hilda as the highest-ranking survivor, but without formal authority to rule. The rebellion needed a symbol, needed someone whose authority derived from more than simply being the most organized opposition group, needed recognition that what they fought for was restoration of legitimate government rather than merely revenge or chaos. Gordon suggested they contact Hilda's uncle, a nobleman who held lands far from Palamecian control and who might lend legitimacy to the rebellion through his support. But reaching him would require passage across the ocean, a journey that the rebellion had no means to accomplish, lacking ships or access to ports where vessels might be hired. The seas themselves had become dangerous, patrolled by Imperial forces and infested with monsters that seemed drawn to the shipping lanes by instincts or instructions no one fully understood. They turned to Layla, a pirate captain whose reputation preceded her in stories of daring raids and narrow escapes, whose ship was fast and whose crew was skilled at avoiding Imperial attention. Pirates were not natural allies of rebellions seeking to restore legitimate government, their profession depending on a certain level of chaos and the absence of strong centralized authority that might suppress their activities. But Layla had her own grievances against the Empire, had lost friends and partners to Imperial anti-piracy campaigns, and was willing to transport the rebellion's representatives if the price was right. Negotiations were conducted in a tavern in a port town that maintained precarious neutrality through bribery and geographic isolation. A place where pirates and merchants and rebels could all conduct business as long as they avoided drawing Imperial attention. Layla was younger than expected for a captain, probably close to Firion's age, with the kind of confidence that comes from succeeding at a profession where failure typically means death. She named a price that was high but not unreasonable. Passage for however many representatives the rebellion wanted to send, delivery to a port near where Hilda's uncle maintained his estate. They sailed at dawn on a vessel that was smaller and faster than the merchant ships that typically cross these waters, designed for quick strikes and rapid escapes rather than carrying maximum cargo. Layla ran her ship with easy authority, her crew responding to her commands with practiced efficiency, the entire operation speaking to a professionalism that belied piracy's reputation as the refuge of the desperate and incompetent. The best pirates were simply merchants, who had decided that force was more efficient than negotiation, who had optimized their business model by eliminating the middle steps of purchase and sale in favor of direct appropriation. The voyage began smoothly, winds favorable and seas calm, the kind of journey where the greatest danger was boredom rather than any actual threat. But the world had changed since the Emperor opened the Jade Passage, and what should have been routine travel now carried risks that had not existed in earlier ages. Monsters infested waters that had once been safe, creatures drawn from depths or spawned by magical corruption, their presence transforming every voyage into a gamble against unknown hazards. They encountered sea serpents on the second day, massive creatures that rose from beneath the waves to coil around the ship's hull, their crushing strength threatening to break the vessel apart. The crew fought them with harpoons and magic, Layla herself wielding enchanted weapons that suggested her success as a pirate came from more than simply sailing skill. Firion and the others joined the battle, their mithril weapons proving effective even against scales designed to withstand deep ocean pressures and predator attacks. But the real threat came not from monsters but from Layla herself, who saw opportunity in transporting representatives of the rebellion and decided that kidnapping them for ransom to either side of the conflict would be more profitable than the fee she had been paid for simple passage. The pirates turned on their passengers midway through the voyage, weapons drawn, intending to overwhelm them through surprise and numbers. The betrayal might have succeeded against ordinary passengers, but the rebellion had sent its most capable fighters precisely because they expected such treachery. The battle on the ship's deck was close and vicious, fought in confined space where numbers mattered less than skill, and where mithril weapons provided decisive advantage. Several pirates fell quickly, their conventional blades shattering against superior metal, their confidence evaporating as they realized the passengers were far more dangerous than anticipated. Layla found herself disarmed and facing Firion's blade, her planned betrayal reversed, her life now dependent on mercy from people she had attempted to kidnap. But before the situation could resolve into execution or imprisonment, the sea itself intervened. The Leviathan rose from the depths, a creature of legend made flesh, massive beyond comprehension, ancient beyond measurement, its very existence defying the scale that human minds could comfortably process. The sea god's emergence created waves that tossed the ship like a child's toy, its bulk displacing water in quantities that transformed the ocean's surface into chaotic turbulence. And then the Leviathan opened its mouth, an abyss lined with teeth, each one larger than a grown man, and swallowed the ship whole. The descent into that living darkness was accompanied by the crushing sensation of water and flesh pressing in from all sides, by the absolute certainty that they were being consumed by something so vast that their entire existence registered as less than a single mouthful. They tumbled through the Leviathan's interior, through chambers that defied anatomy, arriving eventually in a space that could only be described as a stomach, though it was large enough to contain buildings and seemed to have absorbed entire ships over the centuries of the creature's existence. Debris from countless vessels littered the floor, wood and metal and bone creating a grotesque landscape inside a living thing, illuminated by phosphorescent growths that suggested the Leviathan had been alive long enough for entire ecosystems to develop within its digestive system. Among the debris and the dying, they found another survivor, a man named Ricard Highwind, the last of the Dragoons of Deist. His armor identified him even before he spoke, the distinctive design associated with a warrior tradition that had been decimated during the Empire's conquest. Ricard had been searching for something, following rumors and legends, seeking knowledge that might help resistance movements across various kingdoms. His presence inside the Leviathan was the result of being swallowed while investigating reports of the sea god's increased activity, an investigation that had concluded in the worst possible way, but which had somehow not resulted in his immediate death. Ricard explained that the Leviathan was not attacking ships randomly, but was being controlled or influenced by something, some external force directing its behavior to all purposes that served imperial interests. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The ships being swallowed were predominantly those carrying supplies for resistance groups or refugees fleeing conquered territories, while imperial vessels traversed the same waters unmolested. Someone or something had tamed the untamable, had brought a force of nature under control, and was using it as a weapon. Escape from inside the Leviathan required finding a way to make the creature expel them, to become sufficiently irritating or painful that the sea god would vomit them out, rather than continue the digestion process. Ricard had been working on this problem during his own imprisonment, had identified what might be vulnerable points in the creature's anatomy, places where sufficient damage might trigger the defensive response they needed. They fought their way deeper into the Leviathan, battling parasites and monsters that had made homes in the living dungeon, Following Ricard's guidance toward concentrations of nerve tissue where pain receptors existed, informs that a creature this size might actually register. The fighting was desperate and surreal. Combat inside a living thing whose very environment seemed designed to dissolve and digest them, where the floor moved with breathing and the walls contracted with peristalsis. They found the critical point Ricard had described, a nexus of nerve tissue where several major systems converged, and they attacked it with everything they possessed. Mithril weapons cut through flesh that had never been meant to face such assault. Magic burned tissue that had never developed defenses against fire or ice. And eventually, the Leviathan responded exactly as hoped. The creature convulsed, its entire body spasming in reaction to pain, and then it vomited with force sufficient to propel them back up through the passages they had descended, out through the massive mouth, into open water under open sky. They surfaced to find themselves near land, the Leviathan having traveled substantial distance while they were trapped inside, depositing them far from where they had been swallowed. Layla's ship was gone, digested or expelled elsewhere, leaving them stranded but alive. Ricard accompanied them as they made their way to shore, the Dragoon having nowhere else to go and no other allies in this region, his knowledge and skills making him valuable addition to a rebellion that needed every capable fighter it could find. They eventually reached Hilda's uncle through overland routes, presented their case for his support, and received the endorsement they sought, though it came with less material aid than hoped. Legitimate authority mattered, but did not translate directly into military capability, and the rebellion returned to Altair with enhanced political standing, but no immediate solution to the fundamental problem of being outnumbered and out-equipped by an empire that commanded demons and magic alongside conventional forces. What they needed, what Princess Hilda had known they needed since the rebellion's inception, was magic of their own. The Empire drew its power from the Jade Passage and the forces it provided access to, but there existed other sources, other forms of power that might level the battlefield without requiring deals with demons or opening gates that should remain sealed. The ultimate magic, the spell called Ultima, was said to be powerful enough to challenge even the Emperor's forces, but it had been sealed away by ancient civilizations who recognized that such power required protection from those who might misuse it. The Ultima Tome was hidden in Mysidia, in a tower that served as both repository and prison for magical knowledge too dangerous for common access. Minwu, the white wizard who had saved Firion, Maria, and Guy from death in the forest, volunteered to retrieve it. He was one of the few individuals with both the magical skill to navigate the tower's defenses and the moral authority that its guardians might accept as justification for releasing such a potent spell into a world already suffering from magical conflict. Minwu departed for Mysidia with a small escort, knowing the journey would be dangerous and the success uncertain. The tower was protected by barriers that only the most skilled mages could pass, by guardians both living and magical that challenged any who sought access to the knowledge within, by tests that evaluated not just power, but wisdom and the capacity to use power responsibly. Many who entered the Mysidian tower did not return, their hubris or inadequacy proving fatal when measured against standards set by civilizations that had understood magic in ways current practitioners had forgotten. Meanwhile, the rebellion turned its attention to a different problem. The Dragoons of Deist, once a proud order of warriors who rode wyverns into battle, had been systematically destroyed by Imperial forces who recognized them as a significant threat. The wyverns themselves were nearly extinct, hunted almost to elimination, their eggs destroyed wherever found. but Ricard brought word that one egg remained, protected by the last few dragoons who had survived the purge, hidden in Deist itself in hopes that someday the Order might be revived. The journey to Deist took them across territories that showed increasing signs of Imperial presence, through regions where resistance had been crushed and populations subjugated. Deist itself was a ruin, its castle destroyed, its people dead or scattered, its once proud heritage reduced to memory and rubble. The few surviving dragoons they found were wounded and dying, their injuries beyond treatment, their purpose now simply to protect the last wyvern egg until someone worthy could be found to continue the tradition. The egg was kept in a chamber deep beneath Deist's ruins, protected by wards and hidden by construction designed to survive even if the castle above was destroyed. It was large, larger than a person, its shell iridescent and warm to the touch. Life within evident in subtle movements and the faint sound of heartbeat when one pressed ear against the surface. The dying dragoons entrusted it to the rebellion, to Ricard specifically, asking only that the wyvern be raised with care and that the traditions of Deist not be allowed to die completely. The egg required special conditions to hatch, needed to be placed in the spring of life, a magical location where the boundary between life and death grew thin and where new life could be nurtured through exposure to concentrated vitality. The spring was located in remote mountains, accessible only through paths that required mountaineering skill and endurance, but its properties were legendary and had been used for centuries to hatch wyvern eggs when natural incubation proved insufficient. They carried the egg carefully through treacherous terrain, its weight substantial but distributed among multiple carriers, its fragility requiring constant attention to prevent any jarring that might damage the developing creature within. The spring of life revealed itself as a pool fed by waterfalls, its waters glowing with subtle luminescence, its presence radiating a sense of peace and potential that defied easy description. They placed the egg in the shallow water and settled in to wait, knowing that hatching might take days or weeks and that leaving it unguarded would invite disaster. While they maintained their vigil at the spring of life, events were unfolding elsewhere that would reshape the rebellion's circumstances. They returned to Altair after several days to find Princess Hilda missing, the castle in confusion, reports arriving of an attack that had specifically targeted the rebellion's leadership. Imperial forces had infiltrated Altair, bypassing defenses through some combination of treachery and skill, capturing Princess Hilda and deporating before resistance could be organized. The identity of the attacker remained unclear in initial reports, but witnesses described a figure in distinctive armor, someone who moved with speed and precision that marked them as far more than ordinary soldier. The description matched the dark night they had encountered aboard the dreadnought, and Maria's face showed the agony of understanding that Leon had taken their surrogate sister, had captured the woman who had given them purpose and hope, had struck at the heart of everything they were fighting for. But the situation was more complex than straightforward kidnapping. Messages arrived soon after Hilda's disappearance, not from Imperial Command, but from someone claiming to be Hilda herself, inviting the rebellion's leaders to meet at specific locations to discuss possible peace negotiations. The messages were suspicious, too convenient, too perfectly designed to draw key figures into vulnerable positions. Yet they could not simply ignore the possibility that Hilda had been coerced into cooperation, or that the Empire genuinely sought negotiation rather than continued conflict. They investigated the first meeting location and found it was a trap, not Imperial soldiers, but a monster, a Lamia queen who had assumed Hilda's form through magical transformation. The creature had been using Hilda's appearance to lure rebels into ambushes, eliminating resistance leadership through deception rather than force. The battle with the Lamia Queen was vicious, the creature's magic formidable and its physical capabilities enhanced by its supernatural nature. But they prevailed, destroying the imposter and learning from documents she carried that the real Princess Hilda was being held in the Imperial Colosseum, scheduled for public execution as demonstration of what happened to those who opposed Palamecian authority. The Colosseum was in the capital, in the heart of Imperial power, surrounded by forces that could crush the rebellion's entire strength if they attempted frontal assault. But infiltration might be possible, might allow a small group to reach Hilda before her execution and spirit her away before Imperial response could trap them. It was another desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but desperation had become the rebellion's default state, and they had succeeded against worse odds before. They were aided by an unexpected ally, a thief named Paul, whose specialty was impossible infiltrations and whose motivations were mercenary but reliable. Paul had his own reasons for opposing the Empire, grievances that were personal rather than political, but which made him willing to risk his considerable skills helping the rebellion. He provided intelligence about the Colosseum's security, identified weak points in defenses that had been designed to prevent escape rather than infiltration, offered suggestions for how a small team might reach the execution site and extract a high-value prisoner. The infiltration proceeded through sewers and maintenance tunnels, through passages meant for slaves and workers rather than security forces, exploiting the assumption that anyone important would enter through main entrances, while anyone using back routes must be servants unworthy of attention. They reached the Colosseum's interior as Hilda was being brought to the execution platform, emerging from concealment to strike at her guards before the sentence could be carried out. The rescue triggered chaos in the Colosseum, spectators fleeing or freezing, guards converging from all directions, gladiators being released to join the hunt for the infiltrators. They fought running battles through corridors designed for combat entertainment, past caged monsters being maintained for upcoming spectacles, toward exits that seemed to recede further away with each turn. Hilda, weakened from imprisonment but still capable, fought alongside them, refusing to be carried when walking remained possible, determined that her rescue would not come at the cost of those who had risked themselves for her freedom. They escaped the Colosseum through a combination of Paul's knowledge, fighting skill, and sheer audacity, emerging into the capital's streets where continued pursuit could be lost in crowds and narrow alleys. The journey back to Altair was circuitous and exhausting, avoiding Imperial checkpoints and patrols, but they made it with Hilda rescued and the rebellion's leadership restored. But the victory was immediately tempered by devastating news. Word came from Mysidia that something had gone wrong at the tower, that Minwu had successfully navigated its challenges and reached the Chamber of Seals where the Ultima Tome was kept, but that the final barrier required a sacrifice. The seal could only be broken by someone willing to pour their entire life force into its dissolution, to give everything they were and would ever be to release the magic imprisoned within. Minwu had made that choice, had spent himself completely to break the seal, leaving behind the Ultima Tome and only the memory of a man who had given literally everything for the rebellion's cause. The loss struck deeply, Minwu having been present from the rebellion's beginning, having saved Firion, Maria, and Guy when they should have died, having provided healing and wisdom throughout the desperate months of resistance. His sacrifice ensured the rebellion would have access to magic powerful enough to challenge the Empire directly, but the cost felt almost too high to bear. another name added to the growing list of those who had died, so others might have chance at freedom. The Ultima Tome was recovered from the Mysidian tower and brought to Altair, its pages containing knowledge that would take months to fully master, but which immediately enhanced the capabilities of the rebellion's remaining mages. Princess Hilda studied it herself, her own magical abilities being considerable though rarely displayed, determined that Minwu's sacrifice would not be wasted, that his final gift would be used to maximum effect against the empire he had died opposing. Then came worse news, arriving from multiple sources simultaneously in the way that major catastrophes announce themselves. The cyclone had appeared, a massive magical storm that moved with apparent purpose, destroying everything in its path. Towns that had survived the initial conquest, settlements that had maintained some measure of independence or simply been too small to attract imperial attention, were now being obliterated by a tempest that seemed to violate every principle of weather and natural phenomena. The cyclone was no natural storm, but another imperial weapon, magic shaped into meteorological form, directed by will rather than atmospheric pressure. At its center, protected by winds that could shred steel and lightning that struck with targeting precision, flew the emperor himself. Matthias Palamecian had grown tired of gradual conquest, of allowing pockets of resistance to persist, of tolerating any location that was not fully under his control. The cyclone was his solution, a weapon of such power that nothing could stand against it, that reduced all questions of resistance or independence to irrelevance through simple, overwhelming force. Reports arrived of its path, of towns reduced to splinters and ash, of populations caught in the open and scattered like leaves, of defensive positions meaningless when the enemy was the sky itself. The cyclone was moving methodically across the map, erasing every settlement that had maintained autonomy, leaving behind only devastation and the clear message that the age of independent kingdoms had ended permanently. Altair itself lay in the cyclone's projected path, would be reached within days at its current speed, and nothing they possessed could stop or deflect a storm the size of multiple kingdoms. Evacuation was considered, but rejected as impractical. There was nowhere to flee that the cyclone could not eventually reach, no sanctuary that would remain safe once the emperor decided to direct his weapon toward it. If they could not stop the cyclone, if they could not kill the emperor who controlled it, then everything they had fought for would end, scattered to winds that acknowledged no authority except destruction. The solution came from an unexpected source. The wyvern egg had hatched at the spring of life, and the creature had grown with supernatural speed, developing from hatchling to flight-capable mount in days rather than the months or years normal maturation required. Some property of the spring, some interaction between its magical nature and the wyvern's own supernatural biology, had accelerated growth to rates that defied natural law. Ricard bonded with the young wyvern, the traditional dragoon connection forming instantly, and suddenly the rebellion possessed what it had lacked: the ability to fly, to take the fight directly to the emperor in his storm, rather than waiting helplessly on the ground for destruction to arrive. The plan was straightforward because complexity was impossible. They would fly into the cyclone on wyvern back, fight through whatever guardians the emperor had stationed in the storm, reach the center where Matthias waited, and kill him. Failure meant death and the end of all resistance. Success meant removing the empire's head, potentially destabilizing the entire Palamecian war machine, giving hope to every conquered kingdom that liberation might be possible. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Ricard mounted the wyvern. the creature's back large enough to carry multiple riders, its strength sufficient to bear their combined weight, plus weapons and supplies. Gordon volunteered to accompany them, but was denied. The wyvern could not carry more without compromising its flight capabilities, and someone needed to remain in Altair to lead the rebellion if the mission failed. Princess Hilda herself would have gone if they had let her, but her value as leader outweighed her capabilities as fighter, and she reluctantly accepted that her role was to survive and continue organizing resistance regardless of what happened in the cyclone. They flew into the storm as it approached Altair, the wyvern's powerful wings beating against winds that would have torn lesser creatures apart. Its natural affinity for sky, allowing it to navigate turbulence that made conventional flight impossible. The cyclone's outer edges battered them with rain that fell like stones and winds that tried to rip them from their mount, lightning striking close enough that they could feel their hair standing on end from ambient electrical charge. Deeper into the storm, they encountered its guardians, flying monsters and demons, creatures shaped from wind and lightning, enemies that attacked from all directions in the three-dimensional battlefield of the sky. The wyvern proved as formidable in combat as dragoons had always claimed, its claws and teeth tearing through opposition, while its riders fought off attacks from angles the creature could not immediately address. Ricard's spear found targets with precision born from training and natural aptitude, his partnership with the wyvern creating coordination that made them far more effective than the sum of their individual capabilities. They pressed deeper still, past layers of defense, through zones where the wind screamed with voices that might have been human once, but had been transformed into something else through prolonged exposure to the Emperor's magic. The center of the cyclone revealed itself as a region of impossible calm, a bubble of still air where the Emperor waited on a platform of solidified cloud, surrounded by the eye of the storm he commanded. Emperor Matthias Palamecian appeared younger than expected, his face unlined, his bearing regal but not elderly, suggesting either that he had come to power early or that magic had preserved him beyond natural aging. His robes were ornate without being ostentatious, designed more for function than display, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that suggested connections to realms that should not intersect with the mortal world. He showed no surprise at their arrival, no fear at being confronted, only a cold amusement that suggested he had anticipated this meeting and found it mildly entertaining. The Emperor fought with magic, channeling spells of devastating power, bolts of energy that could unmake matter, waves of force that could crush bone and rupture organs, illusions that made determining real from false nearly impossible. He wielded the accumulated magical knowledge of civilization's history, drawing on techniques from cultures that no longer existed and schools of magic that had been deliberately forgotten for the danger they represented. Every spell he cast was calculated to kill, targeted at vulnerable points, exploiting weaknesses he should not have been able to identify so quickly. They countered with everything they had learned, with mithril weapons and developed skills, with Ultima magic learned from Minwu's sacrifice, with the simple determination of people who had survived too much to fail now. The battle raged in the calm center of the cyclone, while around them, the storm continued its destruction, indifferent to whether its creator lived or died, having achieved a kind of autonomous existence that would persist even if the Emperor fell. Ricard and his wyvern harried the Emperor from the air, preventing him from focusing solely on the ground-based combatants, forcing him to divide his attention between multiple threats approaching from different vectors. The wyvern's natural resistance to magic helped protect against spells that would have killed conventional mounts, though even its enhanced durability had limits when facing magic this potent. Ricard fought with the desperate courage of someone representing the last of his order, determined that the dragoons of Deist would not pass from history without accomplishing something worthy of their legend. The Emperor's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance to actual concern as the battle progressed, as mithril weapons cut through his defensive spells, as Ultima magic matched his own casting in power if not sophistication, as it became clear that these opponents were not the helpless rebels he had expected, but warriors who had been forged through suffering into weapons capable of threatening even him. He intensified his attacks, drawing on reserves that common mages could not access, pulling power from sources connected to the Jade Passage and the hellish realm beyond. The killing blow came from unexpected angle, Firion managing to close distance during a moment when the Emperor's attention was focused on deflecting Ricard's aerial assault, his mithril blade finding the gap between spell and skin, penetrating through magical defenses that had seemed impenetrable, sinking into flesh that suddenly proved as vulnerable as any other when faced with steel driven by sufficient force and determination. Emperor Matthias staggered, his concentration breaking, his magic flickering and failing. Blood, surprisingly red and ordinary for someone who commanded demons, spread across his ornate robes. His expression showed shock, the genuine surprise of someone who had believed themselves untouchable, discovering that mortality still applied regardless of power accumulated. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his body collapsing onto the platform of solidified cloud. The Emperor of Palamecian, dead by rebel hand in the heart of his own weapon. The cyclone immediately began to dissipate, its structure dependent on the Emperor's will and magic, collapsing now that both had ceased. The calm center expanded as the winds lost coherence, the storm breaking apart into mundane weather patterns, the devastating weapon transforming into ordinary, if severe, tempest that would spend itself harmlessly over unpopulated regions. They had won, had killed the tyrant whose conquest had reshaped the world, had struck the blow that every resistance movement dreams of achieving. But victory celebrations proved premature. As they flew back toward Altair, as the news of the Emperor's death spread and conquered kingdoms began to hope for liberation, a new proclamation emerged from the imperial capital. The Emperor was dead, but the Empire would continue under new leadership. Leon, the Dark Knight, had seized control, claiming authority through might and through the organization he commanded, declaring himself the new emperor and promising that Palamecian rule would persist despite Matthias's fall. The news devastated Maria, confirming what she had feared but refused to fully believe, that her brother was not merely serving the Empire, but had become one of its architects, that whatever had happened to him after the Black Knights attacked had transformed him so completely that he now sought to perpetuate the very system that had destroyed their family. The hope that they might rescue or redeem him dissolved in the face of his decision to assume imperial leadership, to choose power over reunion, to stand against them deliberately rather than simply being caught on the wrong side through circumstance or coercion. They returned to Altair in triumph that felt hollow, their achievement immense but incomplete, the Emperor dead but the Empire continuing, one tyrant replaced by another who knew them personally and would therefore be even more dangerous as an enemy. Princess Hilda tried to frame the victory positively, emphasizing that they had proved the Empire's leadership was not invincible, that organized resistance could strike even the most protected targets, that hope remained despite setbacks. Then came reports that changed everything. The Emperor had returned. Matthias Palamecian, whom they had watched die, whose body they had left in the dissipating cyclone, now walked again, but changed, transformed, more terrible than before. He had died and descended into hell itself, had conquered that realm through force of will and malevolence, had risen as something no longer merely human, but infused with demonic power and authority over the underworld itself. The Dark Emperor, witnesses called him, a being of such concentrated malice that his mere presence caused the air to curdle and plants to wither, whose return announced that death itself was no longer a barrier to imperial ambition. The transformation of Palamecian Castle reflected its master's new nature. The fortress that had stood for centuries as a monument to imperial power and dynastic succession now twisted into something else, its architecture warping to accommodate geometries that should not exist in the mortal world, its halls filling with demons and undead that served the resurrected emperor with enthusiasm born from shared origin in hell's depths. The castle began to rise, tearing free from its earthly foundations, lifting into the sky on columns of dark energy, becoming pandemonium, a flying fortress of nightmare that made the dreadnought seem a child's toy by comparison. Leon, who had claimed imperial authority in the emperor's absence, found himself suddenly irrelevant. Whatever control he had established over Palamecian forces dissolved in the face of Matthias's return, the military and the demons alike recognizing that the rightful emperor had reclaimed his throne, and that pretenders would be tolerated only as long as they proved useful. Leon's position became precarious, caught between the rebellion he had betrayed and the empire that no longer needed his leadership, his brief taste of authority transforming into something more resembling imprisonment as the resurrected emperor made clear that all power flowed from him alone. Pandemonium began a campaign of destruction that made the previous conquest seem restrained by comparison. The Dark Emperor was no longer interested in ruling kingdoms or extracting tribute from subjugated populations. He had moved beyond such mundane concerns during his time in hell, had developed appetites that could not be satisfied by mere temporal power. He sought to transform the mortal world into an extension of the underworld, to remake reality itself in hell's image, to create a realm where suffering was eternal and hope was a concept so alien that even its memory would be erased from collective consciousness. Towns that had survived the initial conquest now faced annihilation by forces that had transcended the boundary between life and death. The demons that poured from Pandemonium were not the relatively minor entities that had emerged from the Jade Passage, but major powers from Hell's hierarchy, creatures whose existence predated human civilization and whose malevolence had been refined across eons of inflicting torment. They killed not for strategic purpose, but for pleasure, finding joy in destruction that served no goal except suffering itself. The rebellion faced existential crisis. Every victory they had achieved, every sacrifice made in pursuit of freedom, suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of an enemy who had literally conquered death and returned with powers that made his previous capabilities seem quaint. Princess Hilda struggled to maintain morale, to convince fighters that their struggle remained worthwhile, that somehow they could find a way to oppose a foe who had proved that not even death could permanently stop him. Ricard provided the answer, or at least the beginning of one. The Dragoon spoke of ancient texts preserved in Deus archives, records that predated the Palamecian Empire, that described conflicts between human civilization and infernal forces in ages when the boundary between worlds was thinner than it had since become. Those texts spoke of ways to seal or destroy entities that existed partially outside mortal reality, suggested that even beings as powerful as the Dark Emperor possessed vulnerabilities if one understood the nature of their power and the sources from which it derived. The key was the Jade Passage itself, the gateway through which demons entered the mortal world, the connection that sustained Pandemonium's existence and provided the Dark Emperor with his enhanced abilities. If the passage could be closed, if the link between hell and the mortal realm could be severed, then perhaps the Emperor's power would diminish to levels where he could be permanently destroyed. But closing the passage required reaching it, which meant penetrating Pandemonium itself, fighting through the fortress to its foundations where the gateway had been opened, and surviving long enough to enact whatever ritual or violence would seal the breach. The mission was suicidal even by the rebellion standards, requiring them to assault a flying fortress filled with Hell's armies, to battle through demons and undead and whatever other horrors the Dark Emperor had assembled, to reach a location that would be defended with everything the Empire possessed. Yet alternatives were non-existent. If they did nothing, if they allowed Pandemonium to continue its campaign, then the world would be transformed into Hell's annex, and all human life would become raw material for demonic amusement. They prepared with the thoroughness of people who knew they were planning their own deaths, but were determined to make those deaths meaningful. Every weapon was sharpened, every spell practiced, every piece of equipment inspected and reinforced. Princess Hilda insisted on accompanying the assault despite arguments that the rebellion needed her to survive in case the mission failed. She was done sending others to face dangers while remaining safely behind, done asking people to die for causes she claimed to believe in but would not personally risk herself for. If this was to be the rebellion's final stand, she would stand with them. The approach to Pandemonium required the Wyvern, no other means of reaching a fortress that floated in the sky, existed without access to magic or technology beyond the rebellion's capabilities. The creature had grown further since hatching, its bond with Ricard deepening, its capabilities expanding beyond what even traditional dragoons had achieved. It could carry more weight now, could accommodate additional riders, though the numbers remained limited by physical reality and the need to maintain maneuverability during what would certainly be intense aerial combat. They flew toward Pandemonium as darkness fell, the fortress silhouetted against stars that seemed dimmer than they should be, as if the structure itself drained light from the surrounding sky. Its architecture was a nightmare made solid, towers that twisted in spirals no earthly construction could support, walls that seemed to breathe, windows that glowed with fires whose light caused pain to look upon directly. The very substance of the fortress seemed partially insubstantial, as if it existed in multiple realities simultaneously, its form flickering between states in ways that made judging distances and dimensions nearly impossible. They entered through a breach in the outer defenses, a gap that might have been intentional invitation, or might have been structural impossibility in a building whose architecture obeyed no consistent principles. Inside, Pandemonium revealed itself as even worse than external observation suggested. Corridors stretched into infinity, or compressed into spaces too small for human passage, depending on observation angle. Gravity operated inconsistently, some chambers requiring them to walk on walls or ceilings, while others maintained normal orientation, but with subtle wrongness that made movement disorienting. Time itself seemed fluid, seconds stretching into subjective hours, while hours passed in what felt like moments. They fought through legions of demons, creatures that ranged from minor imps to major powers that had commanded armies in Hell's eternal wars. Each battle cost them, injuries accumulated, magical reserves depleted, stamina eroded by constant combat, in an environment designed to exhaust and demoralize. But they pressed forward because turning back meant accepting the world's end, because every step deeper into pandemonium brought them closer to either victory or death, and either was preferable to retreat. They encountered Ricard's death in a chamber where multiple paths converged, where the geometry suggested they were simultaneously deep in the fortress's interior and impossibly close to its outer edges. Demons ambushed from directions that seemed to violate spatial consistency, overwhelming them through numbers and strategic positioning. Ricard and his wyvern held the rear, fighting desperately to allow the others to reach the next chamber and seal the door behind them, knowing that holding position meant certain death, but that retreat meant failure of the entire mission. The dragoons' last moments were obscured by the closing door, sounds of battle muffled by stone and distance, but no one doubted the outcome. Ricard Highwind, last of Deus' dragoons, died as his order had always promised they would, in combat, facing impossible odds, protecting others. His sacrifice buying time measured in minutes but worth purchasing with a life willingly given. The wyvern fought beside him to the end, the bond between dragoon and mount persisting even into death, their final stand becoming the kind of legend that would be told if anyone survived to tell it. They continued deeper, now on foot, the loss of aerial mobility forcing them to navigate Pandemonium's twisted corridors on terms that favored its demonic inhabitants. They found Leon in the fortress's mid-levels, not imprisoned but not free either, existing in a state somewhere between collaborator and captive. His Dark Knight armor showed battle damage. His posture suggested exhaustion that went beyond merely physical, and his expression when he saw them held layers of emotion too complex to pass quickly. Maria approached him with weapons lowered, not trusting but hoping, desperate for any sign that her brother could be reached despite everything that had happened. She spoke to him of their childhood, of promises made before the world fell apart, of the family they had been and might somehow be again, if he would only remember who he was beneath the imperial conditioning and the ambition that had driven him to seize power. Leon's response came slowly, words forced out with difficulty, as if speaking them required overcoming barriers, both external and internal. He told of his capture after the Black Knight attack, of interrogation and torture, of being broken and remade in the Empire's image through methods that combined physical violence with magical manipulation. He spoke of being shown power, of being offered position and authority as reward for service, of choosing survival and advancement over loyalty to people who might already be dead. He had believed Firion, Maria, and Guy had perished in the forest, had convinced himself that embracing the Empire was pragmatic adaptation rather than betrayal. But seeing them alive, confronting the reality of what his choices had cost, facing the knowledge that they had been fighting the Empire while he served it, something in Leon cracked. Not a sudden transformation or instant redemption, but the beginning of recognition that the path he had chosen led only to serving a monster who would eventually discard or destroy him like every other tool that outlived its usefulness. The Dark Emperor cared nothing for Leon's ambitions, saw him as temporary convenience at best, and would sacrifice him without hesitation if doing so served any purpose. Leon joined them then, not with declarations or apologies, but with the simple act of drawing his sword and pointing it toward Pandemonium's depths, rather than at his former family. They would reach the Jade Passage together, would attempt to close it and end the Dark Emperor's power, and if they succeeded, if they somehow survived, then perhaps there would be time to address everything that had happened and begin whatever painful process of reconciliation or severance their relationship required. United now, the five of them descended into Pandemonium's lowest levels, into regions where reality grew increasingly tenuous and where the boundary between mortal world and hell became so thin as to be nearly non-existent. The architecture here defied description. Walls that seemed to bleed, floors that whispered in voices speaking languages that hurt to hear, ceilings that displayed scenes of torment from hell itself, as if they were windows rather than stone. They found the Jade Passage in a chamber at Pandemonium's absolute foundation, the point where the fortress touched reality most directly. The gateway was a wound in space itself, a tear through which infernal energy poured in visible streams, through which demons could pass freely in both directions, through which the Dark Emperor drew the power that sustained his resurrected form. Closing it would require not just physical force but magical intervention, required understanding the principles by which it had been opened and reversing them while under assault by everything the passage's guardians could muster. Princess Hilda began the ritual, drawing on Ultima magic and her own considerable abilities, weaving spells designed to seal breaches between worlds, to force the wound closed despite resistance from the energies flowing through it. The process was slow and required intense concentration, leaving her vulnerable and the others responsible for defending her while she worked. Demons poured through the passage in increasing numbers. Recognizing the threat, determined to prevent the sealing regardless of cost. The battle that followed was chaos in its purest form, combat against enemies that respawned faster than they could be killed, fighting that required holding position rather than achieving victory, survival measured in seconds accumulated into minutes that felt like hours. Firion, Maria, Guy and Leon formed a perimeter around Hilda, their weapons moving in constant motion, their magic exhausted, but their bodies still capable of violence, their determination the only thing preventing overwhelming force from crushing them. The ritual reached its climax as Hilda poured everything she possessed into the final sealing, her life force channeling through Ultima spells into magic that forced the Jade Passage to contract, to close, to seal itself against the pressure trying to hold it open. The wound in reality began to heal, demons still partially through it being severed, the flow of infernal energy diminishing to trickle and then to nothing. The passage closed with a sound like reality sighing in relief, the tear mending, the gateway sealed in ways that would require centuries of work to reopen if it could be opened at all. Pandemonium shuddered as its foundation was destroyed, the fortress's existence dependent on the connection to hell that had just been severed. The entire structure began to collapse, its impossible architecture unable to maintain form without the infernal energy that had sustained it, its substance dissolving as it fell from the sky toward earth far below. They ran through corridors that were actively disappearing, racing against structural failure that accelerated with each passing second, seeking any exit before the fortress completed its transformation from nightmare-made solid to rubble scattered across miles of landscape. They emerged onto Pandemonium's exterior as it plummeted, the ground rushing up to meet them with terminal velocity, death by impact seconds away. But wyverns, it turned out, possessed instincts that transcended their riders' deaths, and Ricard's mount had survived the battle that killed the dragoon, had followed them through Pandemonium's halls, had waited for this moment when it might fulfill its final duty to companions its master had died protecting. The creature swept beneath them as they fell, its claws grasping riders and bearing them away from the disintegrating fortress, its wings beating with desperate strength to gain altitude and distance before the impact. Pandemonium struck the Earth seconds later. The explosion of its landing visible from miles away, the shockwave flattening forests and raising dust clouds that would take days to settle. When the debris finally cleared, nothing remained of the fortress except scattered rubble and the fading stench of sulfur that would mark the site for years. The Dark Emperor, if he had been anywhere in the structure when it fell, was gone, his physical form destroyed and his connection to hell severed, leaving him unable to manifest in the mortal world regardless of how powerful he might remain in his own domain. They descended to Earth far from Pandemonium's crash site, landing in a field where grass grew green and sky showed blue, unsullied by demonic influence. The Wyvern collapsed from exhaustion once its riders were safely grounded, its duty fulfilled, its own survival uncertain, but its purpose achieved. They stood together in silence, too drained for celebration, too aware of losses to feel simple triumph, but alive and successful, and confronting a future that was now genuinely open, rather than foreclosed by inevitable imperial victory. The world that emerged in the aftermath of Pandemonium's fall was irrevocably changed from what had existed before the Emperor's conquest. Kingdoms that had fallen remained fallen, their governmental structures destroyed or so compromised by collaboration that restoration was impractical. Populations had been scattered, displaced, traumatized by years of occupation and violence. The physical landscape bore scars from magical weapons and demonic incursions. Regions where reality remained somewhat unstable and where monsters bred true from the corruption that had seeped into soil and water. But the worst was over. The Palamecian Empire, deprived of its leadership and its demonic reinforcements, collapsed into warring factions and regional powers that lacked the coordination or unity to continue the conquest. Imperial soldiers deserted or surrendered, many of them conscripts who had never supported the war, but had lacked any means of resistance or escape. The demons that had served the Emperor either retreated to hell through whatever minor passages remained, or were hunted down by coalition forces determined to eliminate every trace of infernal presence. Princess Hilda was crowned Queen of Fynn in a ceremony that was more modest than traditional coronations, but carried profound meaning for those who attended. She had earned authority not through inheritance alone, but through years of leading a desperate resistance, through personal sacrifice and shared suffering with those she now ruled. Her coronation represented not restoration of the old order, but creation of something new, a government that understood tyranny's face and was determined to build systems that might prevent such concentrated power from ever again threatening freedom. The rebellion's surviving members were honored, their names recorded in histories that would be studied for generations, their sacrifices acknowledged even as many uncomfortable questions about methods and costs were quietly set aside in favor of celebrating victory. Firion, Maria, and Guy chose not to remain in Fynn's reconstructed court, uncomfortable with the attention and formality, preferring to travel and help with reconstruction efforts in regions where the war's damage had been most severe. They had become warriors through necessity rather than choice, and now that necessity had passed, they sought ways to return to something resembling normal life, even knowing that normalcy was forever changed by what they had experienced. Leon departed alone, unable to fully reconcile with his siblings despite fighting alongside them in Pandemonium. His guilt and shame over his imperial service too great to simply be forgiven or forgotten. He spoke of journeys to distant lands, of seeking purpose beyond warfare, of trying to understand who he was when stripped of both imperial authority and family connection. Maria let him go with tears and embraces, and promises that he would always be welcome to return if he ever found peace sufficient to face them again. Whether he would remain uncertain, but the possibility existed, and that possibility was more than had seemed likely during the years when he served the Empire. Gordon returned to Kashwan and began the work of rebuilding his kingdom from the devastation of conquest and occupation. He carried with him the knowledge of his brother's death and his own failure during Fynn's defense, burdens that would never fully lighten, but which had been transmuted through subsequent actions into something he could bear rather than be crushed by. He proved a capable ruler, his careful planning and attention to detail serving peacetime governance better than they had served desperate combat. His reign becoming known for justice and prosperity built on foundations of remembered suffering. Joseph returned to Salamand with his daughter Nellie and the other survivors of the mining camp, dedicated to rebuilding not just structures but community, to creating something better than what had existed before, rather than simply attempting to restore what the Empire had destroyed. He became a leader without seeking leadership, his natural authority, and earned respect, making him the person others turned to when decisions needed to be made or conflicts needed to be resolved. Paul the thief vanished into whatever shadows produced people of his profession, his contributions to the rebellion acknowledged, but his preference for anonymity respected. Layla returned to piracy, though with a more selective targeting that avoided preying on those still struggling with war's aftermath. Her vessel becoming something of a legend among merchants, who never quite knew if seeing her sails meant danger or simply an encounter with someone who had moved on to more interesting pursuits. The Wyvern recovered from its exhaustion and eventually returned to the ruins of Deist, settling in the mountains where the Dragoon Order had once thrived, becoming guardian of that memory and perhaps the seed from which some future generation might restore what had been lost. Occasionally, travelers reported seeing it flying over the peaks at dawn or dusk, a reminder that some connections transcended death and that sacrifice was not always pointless, even when it appeared to accomplish nothing immediate. The Jade Passage remained sealed, its location lost deliberately. The knowledge of how to reopen it restricted to a few who agreed never to record the information in writing or pass it to successors, determined that such gateways should remain closed regardless of what temptations might be offered by access to infernal power. Hell still existed, demons still inhabited their own realm, but the barrier between worlds had been restored and maintained its integrity, preventing casual incursions and ensuring that any future attempt to breach it would require effort sufficient to attract attention and opposition. The world settled into an uneasy peace, not the naive tranquility of the pre-war era, but something harder and more knowing, a recognition that peace required maintenance and vigilance, that freedom was not guaranteed by victory, but had to be defended continuously against threats both external and internal. Kingdoms rebuilt, populations recovered, scars healed, or at least became familiar enough to be incorporated into new normal, rather than remaining open wounds. But legends persisted of what had been accomplished. Stories told to children about ordinary people who faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed, who proved that courage could triumph over power when combined with determination and sacrifice, who demonstrated that even the darkest moments contained seeds of hope if someone was brave enough to nurture them. The wild rose became symbol not just of Fynn, but of resistance itself, reminder that tyranny was never inevitable, and that ordinary people possessed within themselves capabilities they would never discover except through being tested in ways no one should ever have to endure. Firion, Maria, and Guy eventually settled in a small town far from Fynn's rebuilt capital, choosing anonymity over recognition, preferring the quiet satisfaction of helping their immediate community over the more abstract rewards of historical significance. They had saved the world, or at least been part of the group that accomplished that impossible task. And now they wanted simply to live in the world they had preserved, to enjoy the peace they had purchased with years of their youth and the blood of friends who had not survived to see victory. They would sometimes speak of those years, of battles and sacrifices, of friends lost and enemies overcome, of moments when everything seemed hopeless, but they continued anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. But mostly, they focused on the present and the future, on the opportunities that peace provided, on the simple pleasures of life lived without constant threat of violence or the weight of knowing that failure meant not just personal death, but the enslavement or destruction of everyone they cared about. The Emperor was dead, twice over, his spirit confined to hell from which he could not again escape without the Jade Passage that had been sealed against him. Leon lived somewhere in the world, seeking redemption or oblivion, or simply trying to forget. His ultimate fate unknown, but his story continuing somewhere beyond their sight. Princess Hilda, now Queen Hilda, ruled with wisdom earned through suffering, determined that the kingdom she had fought to preserve would become something worth the sacrifices made for it. And across the world, in kingdoms recovered and regions restored, people lived their lives in the freedom that had been preserved through the actions of a few who refused to accept that tyranny was inevitable. The rebellion had succeeded not because they were special or chosen by destiny, but because they had made choices again and again to continue fighting even when reason suggested surrender, to protect others even at cost to themselves, to believe in possibility of victory even when evidence overwhelmingly favored defeat. That was the ultimate legacy of Final Fantasy II's story. Not that heroes would always emerge to save the world, not that good inevitably triumphed over evil, but that ordinary people possessed capacity for extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it, that hope was not a given, but something created through choice and action, that freedom's price was eternal vigilance and the willingness of each generation to stand against forces that sought to extinguish it. The story ended not with certainty that threats would never again arise, but with confidence that when they did, someone would stand against them, that the pattern of resistance would continue because the alternative was unthinkable and the cost of failure too high to accept. The world they saved was imperfect, scarred, diminished from what it might have been if the Emperor had never opened the Jade Passage and begun his conquest. But it was a world where people could live free, where children could grow without knowing the terror of occupation, where the future remained open rather than foreclosed by tyrannical vision that acknowledged no value beyond power. That alone was worth everything they had endured, every sacrifice made, every friend lost, every moment of suffering. That had seemed unbearable at the time, but which in retrospect became simply the price that had to be paid for freedom's preservation. And so the story concluded, not with grand statements or prophecies about future ages, but with simple acknowledgement that the fight had been won, the world had been saved, and life could continue. The Wild Rose Rebellion had succeeded in its impossible mission. Ordinary people had achieved extraordinary things, and tyranny had been defeated by those who refused to accept defeat as inevitable. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the end, what else could anyone offer except their effort, their courage, and their willingness to stand against darkness even when victory seemed impossible? They had given those things freely, had paid the cost that such giving required, and the world that survived because of their actions was their reward and their memorial, their success and their triumph, their story and their legacy. The rebellion was over, but its spirit would endure, passed down through generations, not as abstract history, but as lived example of what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to accept that ordinary was all they could be, when they chose to become something more because the world needed them to be more, when they looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible was simply another word for difficult, rather than a final assessment of what could be achieved. That lesson, more than any specific battle or victory, was what Final Fantasy II offered to those who experienced its story. The reminder that we are all capable of more than we believe, that courage can be found when it is needed most, and that even the darkest night must eventually yield to dawn if someone is willing to keep fighting until the sun rises. If you found this journey through rebellion and resistance compelling, through ordinary people becoming heroes through necessity rather than destiny, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that shaped gaming history. Share your own memories of Final Fantasy II in the comments. The moments that stayed with you, the sacrifices that moved you, the victories that felt earned through genuine struggle. These stories matter not just as entertainment, but as explorations of human resilience and the eternal question of how we respond when faced with tyranny and overwhelming odds. Until next time, may your own rebellion succeed and your sacrifices never be in vain.